Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The gas station that sold souls, from Hauling Hank. I've been driving these highways for 32 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the road had to offer. I've watched sunrises paint the desert orange and gold. I've felt the loneliness of empty interstates at 3 in the morning, and I've pulled over to help stranded families more times than I can count. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I found at that gas station just outside of Nowhere, Nevada. It was one of those nights where the darkness felt thicker than usual, like the sky had pressed down closer to the earth and was trying to smother everything beneath it. My rig was running low on diesel, and I was running low on patience. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, pushing the limits like I always did back then, chasing deadlines and dollars with equal desperation. The GPS had stopped working about 50 miles back, which wasn't unusual in that part of the country where the mountains played hell with the satellites and civilization, was just a rumor on the wind. That's when I saw the lights. They appeared suddenly, glowing warm and yellow in the distance like a beacon calling sailors home from a stormy sea. At first, I felt relief wash over me, that familiar gratitude you feel when you find exactly what you need right when you need it most. But as I got closer, something started to feel wrong in a way I couldn't quite name. The lights didn't flicker like normal fluorescent bulbs do, and there were no other vehicles anywhere in sight, which was strange for a gas station that appeared to be open for business in the middle of the night. I pulled my rig into the lot, and the silence hit me immediately. When you drive a truck for as long as I have, you get used to the constant rumble and hum of the engine. The way it becomes like a heartbeat you can feel through the steering wheel and the seat beneath you. When that stops, the quiet rushes in like water filling a void, and it can be disorienting. But this silence was different. It wasn't just the absence of my engine's noise. It was the absence of everything. No wind, no insects, no distant highway sounds, nothing at all. The gas station itself looked like something out of the 1950s. One of those classic roadside stops with big windows and chrome fixtures that caught the light in ways that seemed almost nostalgic. The pumps were old-fashioned too, the kind with rolling numbers behind glass panels, and they gleamed like they'd been polished that very afternoon. A neon sign above the door read Last Chance Fueling Station in cursive letters that hummed softly, the only sound in that oppressive silence. I climbed down from my cab, my boots hitting the pavement with a sound that seemed too loud, and I looked around for any sign of other people. The parking lot was empty, except for my truck, and the road behind me stretched back into darkness like it went on forever, without ever reaching anywhere real. I walked toward the store entrance, watching my reflection approach in the glass door, and I noticed that I looked tired in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep. The door opened before I could touch it, swinging inward smoothly and silently, and warm air rushed out, carrying the smell of coffee and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. Inside, the store was immaculate, with shelves stocked perfectly and floors that shone like they'd been waxed within the hour. Behind the counter stood a man who smiled at me with teeth that were too white and too straight, like he'd never drunk coffee or smoked a cigarette in his entire life. "Evening, driver," he said, and his voice was smooth as honey poured over warm bread. "What can I do for you tonight?" I told him I needed diesel, as much as my tanks would hold, and he nodded slowly, his smile never wavering, never quite reaching his eyes. "Of course," he said, "we can fill you right up. But first, maybe you'd like to come inside, stretch your legs, have a cup of coffee on the house. You look like you could use a moment's rest." There was something about the way he said it that made me want to refuse, some instinct deep in my gut that told me to pump my fuel and get back on the road as fast as possible. But I was tired, bone-tired in a way that made my legs feel heavy and my thoughts feel slow. So I found myself nodding and walking toward the coffee station near the back of the store. The coffee was hot and fresh, tasting better than gas station coffee had any right to taste, and I felt some of the tension start to drain from my shoulders as I drank it. "You've been driving a long time," the clerk said, not asking, but stating it like he already knew everything about me. 32 years, isn't it? That's a long time to spend away from home, away from the people who love you, away from everything that makes life worth living. I looked at him sharply, wondering how he could possibly know how long I'd been driving, but he just kept smiling that unsettling smile. "I'm just good at reading people," he said, like he'd heard the question I hadn't asked out loud. He came around the counter then, moving with a grace that seemed unnatural for a man his size, and he gestured toward a display case I hadn't noticed before. Inside were objects that glowed softly in the fluorescent light. Small things that looked like they might be made of glass or crystal or something else entirely. "Can I show you something special?" he asked. "Something that might interest a man who's given so much of his life to the road." Against my better judgment, I walked closer to the case and looked inside. The objects were beautiful in a way that was hard to describe, each one unique and intricate, catching the light and throwing it back in colors I'd never seen before. "What are they?" I asked, my voice sounding strange in my own ears, and the clerk's smile grew wider. "These," he said, "are second chances, new beginnings. Freedom from the road, from the loneliness, from the endless miles that never seem to lead anywhere that matters." He reached into the case and pulled out one of the objects, holding it up so it caught the light and seemed to pulse with an inner radiance. "For a very special price," he said, "you could have everything you've ever wanted. A home that stays in one place, a family that knows your name, a life that doesn't disappear in your rearview mirror every morning. All you have to do is make a simple exchange." Something cold wrapped around my spine as I listened to him talk, and I felt my hand drift toward my wallet without consciously deciding to reach for it. "What kind of exchange?" I heard myself ask, and his eyes glittered in the fluorescent light. "Nothing you'll miss," he said softly. "Just a little piece of yourself, something you've already worn down to nothing from all these years on the road. Your soul is tired, driver. Let me take it off your hands, and I'll give you everything you've dreamed about during all those lonely nights in your cab." The word soul crashed through the fog in my mind like a church bell, ringing out a warning, and suddenly I could see clearly again. I looked at the object in his hand and realized it wasn't glowing at all. It was dark and cold and somehow hollow, like a container waiting to be filled. I looked at the clerk and saw that his smile had frozen into something predatory and ancient, and I understood with a clarity that cut through my exhaustion that this place was not what it seemed. I stepped back from the counter, nearly spilling my coffee, and I saw his expression shift into something like disappointment mixed with hunger. "You're making a mistake," he said, and his voice had lost its honey-smooth quality, becoming rough and layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. "You'll go back to that truck, back to that endless road, back to the loneliness and the exhaustion, and for what? For pride, for principle. Those things won't keep you warm at night." But I was already moving toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to escape my ribcage. I pushed through the exit and ran to my truck, fumbling with the door handle and hauling myself up into the cab with shaking hands. The engine turned over on the first try, roaring to life like it was as eager to leave as I was, and I threw the rig into gear without bothering to check my mirrors. As I pulled out of that parking lot, I glanced back once and saw the clerk standing in the doorway, still holding that dark, hollow object in his hands. The gas station's lights were flickering now, pulsing in and out like a dying heartbeat, and I could see other figures moving inside the store, shadow shapes that didn't look quite human. The neon sign above the door was sparking and buzzing, the letters rearranging themselves into words I didn't want to read. I drove for 2 hours straight before I dared to stop again. And when I finally did pull over at a legitimate truck stop with other drivers and bright lights, and the beautiful mundane sounds of normal life, I checked my fuel gauge. It was full, completely full, even though I'd never pumped a single gallon at that nightmare station. I sat there in my cab, shaking and sweating despite the cold night air. And I understood that I'd come closer to losing everything than I'd ever want to admit. Since that night, I've seen that gas station 3 more times over the years, always appearing when I'm at my most tired, my most desperate, my most vulnerable. Each time, I've driven past without stopping, no matter how low my fuel runs, no matter how much my body screams for rest. I've learned to recognize the signs now, the way the darkness feels thicker, the way the silence presses in too close, the way those warm yellow lights appear like promises in the distance. I still drive these highways, still chase deadlines and dollars, still feel the loneliness that comes with this life I've chosen. But I've never forgotten what I almost traded away at that gas station, and I've never stopped being grateful that something in me, some stubborn spark of self-preservation, made me walk away, because some prices are too high to pay, no matter what they're offering, and some roads are meant to be traveled with your soul intact, even if it's tired and worn from all the miles. The thing watching from the woods from Mudflap, Mike, the stretch of highway between Portland and Seattle has always been one of my favorite runs. With those massive Douglas firs pressing in close on both sides, and the way the fog rolls through the trees in the early morning like something out of a dream. I've driven that route hundreds of times over the past 20 years, hauling everything from lumber to electronics, and I thought I knew every curve, every rest stop, every mile marker by heart. But there was one night when the woods showed me something I'd never seen before, something that changed the way I look at those dark spaces between the trees. It was late October, and the weather had turned cold and wet the way it does in the Pacific Northwest, with rain that came down in sheets and made the road gleam like black glass under my headlights. I was running behind schedule because of an accident that had closed the highway for 3 hours, and I was pushing hard to make up time, maybe pushing harder than I should have been. The windshield wipers were working overtime, thumping back and forth in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, and the world outside my windows had narrowed down to just the stretch of road illuminated by my high beams and the wall of darkness beyond. Around midnight, I saw the deer. She came bounding out of the woods without warning, her eyes catching my lights and flashing green for just a moment before she disappeared across the highway and vanished into the trees on the other side. My heart was still pounding from the near miss when I realized I wasn't alone on this stretch of road anymore. There, in the spot where the deer had emerged, something else was standing at the edge of the tree line, something tall and motionless that didn't belong. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a tree stump or a shadow cast by my headlights. One of those optical illusions that happen when you've been driving too long and your brain starts playing tricks on you. But as I got closer, I could see that it had a shape that was too deliberate, too organized to be natural. It looked almost like a person, but wrong in proportions I couldn't quite define from this distance. With limbs that seemed too long and a head that sat at an angle that made my stomach turn. I should have just kept driving. That would have been the smart thing to do. The sensible thing that any experienced driver would tell you to do when you see something strange on a lonely road at midnight. But something made me slow down. Some morbid curiosity, or maybe just the simple human need to understand what I was seeing. I eased off the accelerator and let the truck coast closer, and as I did, the thing at the edge of the woods moved. It didn't move like a person moves, with the natural sway and balance that comes from having joints and muscles that work the way they're supposed to. It moved in a way that reminded me of stop-motion animation, jerky and unnatural, like it was skipping frames between one position and the next. One moment it was standing still, and the next it had shifted several feet to the left, and I hadn't seen the movement between those 2 points, just the before and after. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I felt every instinct I had screaming at me to accelerate, to get past this thing and leave it behind in my mirrors. But I couldn't seem to make my foot press down on the gas pedal. I was frozen, watching as the thing moved again, this time stepping fully out onto the shoulder of the road. In the glow of my headlights, I could see it more clearly now, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, with arms that hung down past where its knees should have been, and fingers that looked too long and too numerous. Its head was the worst part, turned at an impossible angle, like someone had grabbed it and twisted it 90 degrees, and it had just stayed that way. Where its face should have been, there was nothing I could recognize as features. Just a smooth expanse that might have been skin, or bark, or something else entirely. And as I stared at it, I had the overwhelming sensation that it was staring back at me. The rain continued to pour down, streaming across my windshield, and creating patterns of light and shadow. But the thing didn't seem to be affected by the weather at all. It stood there motionless again, and I realized that I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my engine and the rain. No wind, no forest sounds, nothing but the mechanical rumble of my truck and the rhythmic beating of the wipers. Then it moved again, and this time it moved toward me, taking one of those impossible jerky steps that covered far more ground than it should have. It was on the shoulder, then it was at the edge of the road, then it was standing directly in front of my truck, close enough that I should have hit it, close enough that I could see the way its two long fingers twitched and moved independently of each other like they were, searching for something to grab. I slammed on the brakes without thinking, and my rig began to slide on the wet pavement, the trailer starting to jackknife as the wheels lost traction. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion, and too fast at the same time. I was fighting the wheel, trying to regain control, and the thing was still standing there right in front of me, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was about to hit it. But I didn't. The truck slid to a stop with the bumper just inches from where the thing stood, and in the sudden silence after the engine stalled, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the hammering of my heart. The thing tilted its head, or what passed for its head, in a gesture that might have been curiosity, or might have been something else entirely. And then it moved again, this time sliding around to the driver's side of my cab. I couldn't see it anymore. Couldn't see anything but the dark woods and the rain-slicked road in my mirrors, and that was somehow worse than having it in front of me. I knew it was there, could feel its presence like a weight pressing against the side of the truck. And I sat frozen in my seat, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too loudly, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it, a sound like fingernails on metal, long slow scratches that ran down the length of my door, and I watched in horror as thin lines appeared in the paint, deep gouges that went through to the bare metal beneath. The scratching moved lower, toward the window, and I could see the glass starting to flex inward under the pressure of something pressing against it from outside. That was when my survival instincts finally kicked in and overrode the paralysis that had gripped me. I turned the key in the ignition with shaking hands, and the engine roared back to life like it had been waiting for permission to save us both. I threw the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator, not caring about the wet road or the possibility of sliding, caring only about putting distance between myself and whatever was outside my door. The truck lurched forward, and I heard a sound like branches breaking, a sharp crack that seemed too loud, even over the engine noise. I didn't look back, didn't check my mirrors, just kept my eyes on the road ahead and drove faster than I'd ever driven on a wet highway, pushing the rig to speeds that would have gotten my license pulled if any cop had seen me. I drove for an hour straight before I felt safe enough to pull over at a truck stop outside Olympia, and when I finally climbed down from my cab to inspect the damage, I found the scratches exactly where I'd heard them, 4 long gouges that ran from the door handle down to the bottom of the door. They were deep enough that I could fit my fingertip into them, and they were spaced in a way that suggested fingers, but fingers that were far too long and far too strong to belong to anything human. I asked the other drivers at the truck stop if they'd seen anything strange on that stretch of highway, but they all shook their heads and looked at me with the kind of concern you reserve for someone who might be cracking under the pressure of too many hours on the road. I didn't blame them for their skepticism. If someone had told me this story, I probably wouldn't have believed it either, but I know what I saw that night, and I know what left those marks on my door. I still drive the Portland to Seattle route, still haul loads through those dark forests, but I never drive that stretch at midnight anymore, and I never slow down when I see something strange at the edge of the woods. because I learned that night that there are things living in those spaces between the trees, things that watch the road and wait for drivers who are curious or foolish enough to stop and take a closer look. The scratches are still on my door, covered now with touch-up paint that doesn't quite match, but I know they're there. Sometimes, when I'm driving through heavy fog and the trees press close on either side, I catch glimpses of tall shapes standing at the edge of the forest, motionless and watching. I don't slow down anymore. I just keep driving, keep moving forward, and I try not to think about what might happen if my truck ever breaks down on one of those dark stretches of highway where the cell signal dies and the nearest help is miles away. The girl who laughed from the ditch. From Redneck Rick, I grew up in truck stops and diners, riding shotgun with my old man from the time I was 6 years old until I was big enough to reach the pedals myself. He taught me everything about this life, about the road and the rigs and the unwritten rules that keep drivers safe when they're out here alone. But there was one rule he never told me about, one piece of wisdom I had to learn the hard way on a stretch of back road in rural Mississippi on a night when the moon was full and the air was thick with the smell of magnolias and something else, something rotten, underneath. I was 23 years old and cocky as hell, running an independent operation with a beat-up Peterbilt I'd bought at auction and a chip on my shoulder about proving I could make it without anyone's help. I was hauling a load of farm equipment from Jackson to Mobile, taking the back roads because I'd heard rumors of dot inspections on the main highways and my logbook wasn't exactly up to regulation standards. The road I chose cut through some of the poorest, most isolated country I'd ever seen, past trailer parks with more rust than metal, and towns that looked like they'd been abandoned sometime in the 1950s. It was past 2 in the morning when I saw her, a flash of white in my peripheral vision that made me tap the brakes without really thinking about it. At first, I thought it might be a dog or a deer, something that had wandered onto the road and might cause damage if I hit it at full speed. But as my truck slowed, I realized what I was seeing was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in the ditch beside the road in a white nightgown that seemed to glow in the moonlight. My first instinct was concern, the kind of gut-level worry you feel when you see a child somewhere they shouldn't be, especially at this hour of the night on a road this empty. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, and climbed down from the cab to see if she needed help. As my boots hit the ground, I called out to her, asking if she was okay, if she was lost, if there was someone I could call for her. She didn't answer right away, just stood there in the ditch looking up at me with eyes that caught the moonlight and reflected it back in a way that reminded me of an animal's eyes and headlights. Then, slowly, she smiled, and that smile made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. It was too wide, stretching across her face in a way that showed too many teeth, and there was something wrong with the way it sat on her features, like she was wearing a mask of a smiling child over something else entirely. I took a step back toward my truck, some primal part of my brain recognizing danger, even if my conscious mind was still trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when she laughed. It started as a giggle, high and clear, like you'd expect from a little girl, but it didn't stay that way. The laughter grew louder and deeper, spiraling down into registers that no child's voice should be able to reach, and it seemed to echo off the trees lining the road and come back at me from multiple directions at once. I turned and ran back to my truck, my heart hammering in my chest and my hands fumbling with the door handle. Behind me, the laughter continued, rising and falling in waves that seemed to physically push against me, and I could hear something else underneath it now, a sound like rustling leaves, or maybe like something dragging itself through the underbrush. I hauled myself up into the cab and slammed the door, twisting the lock with shaking fingers and reaching for the ignition. That's when I made the mistake of looking in my side mirror. The girl was no longer in the ditch. She was standing right beside my truck, close enough that I should have heard her approaching, close enough that her face was level with my window, but she wasn't standing on the ground. She was floating, suspended in the air, with her feet dangling inches above the pavement, and her head was tilted at an angle that would have broken a normal person's neck. Her eyes met mine in the mirror, and I saw that they were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just empty darkness that seemed to pull at something deep inside me. She raised one hand and pressed it against my window, and where her palm touched the glass, frost began to spread outward in intricate patterns, creeping across the surface like living ice. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse, and in that silence, I heard her speak. "Why are you leaving?" she asked, and her voice was sweet and innocent, and absolutely terrifying in its normalcy. "Don't you want to play with me? I've been waiting so long for someone to play with. Everyone else drives past and never stops. But you stopped. You saw me. That means you have to play with me now." I twisted the key in the ignition, and the engine turned over but wouldn't catch, coughing and sputtering like it was as desperate to leave as I was, but couldn't quite manage it. The girl moved closer to the window, her face pressing against the glass, and I could see now that her features were subtly wrong, in ways that became more obvious the longer I looked at her. Her mouth was too wide, her teeth too sharp, and where her nose should have been, there were just two small slits that moved when she breathed. "Play with me," she said again. And this time there was something like anger creeping into her voice, something old and cold and absolutely inhuman. "You have to play with me. Those are the rules. You stopped. You looked. You acknowledged me. You can't leave now." The engine finally caught, roaring to life with a sound that felt like salvation, and I threw the truck into gear without waiting, without thinking, just needing to move, to get away from this thing that looked like a child but wasn't, couldn't be. The truck lurched forward, and I heard a sound like breaking glass as something hit the side mirror, shattering it into a spiderweb of cracks. I accelerated hard, the truck picking up speed faster than it probably should have been able to with a full load, and in the remaining mirrors, I could see the girl standing in the middle of the road behind me, getting smaller as the distance grew. But she wasn't getting smaller fast enough, even as I pushed the truck to 60, 70, speeds that were dangerous on these narrow back roads. She seemed to be keeping pace, always visible in my mirrors, always standing in the center of the road with her arms hanging at her sides and her head tilted at that impossible angle. Then I heard her voice again, not from behind me, but from inside the cab, coming from the speakers of my CB radio, even though it was turned off, coming from the vents in the dashboard, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't run fast enough," she said, and she was laughing again. That terrible descending laughter that made my chest feel tight and my vision start to blur. "I'll always be here, waiting in the ditches, standing in the roads, looking for drivers who are polite enough to stop, curious enough to look. You'll see me again. Maybe not tonight, maybe not next week, but eventually, you'll see me again, and next time, you won't drive away." I drove for 3 straight hours, taking turns at random, not caring where I ended up, as long as it was away from that stretch of road. By the time the sun started to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I was somewhere in Alabama, lost and exhausted, and shaking so hard, I could barely hold the wheel. I pulled into the first truck stop I saw, and sat in the parking lot with the engine running, not ready to turn it off, not ready to be alone in the silence. Other drivers came and went, going about their morning routines, drinking coffee and checking their loads, and complaining about traffic and weather and all the normal things that drivers complain about. I wanted to tell them what I'd seen, wanted to warn them about the back roads in Mississippi and the girl in the white nightgown who laughs in frequencies that hurt your soul. But when I opened my mouth to speak, no words came out, and I realized that some experiences are too far outside the realm of normal understanding to be shared. I got my truck fixed up, got the mirror replaced, and eventually made my way back onto the highways, sticking to the main routes where there are lights and other vehicles, and the comforting presence of civilization, even in the dead of night. I never took another backroad shortcut, never again let curiosity or convenience tempt me onto those lonely stretches of pavement that cut through the poorest, most forgotten corners of the country. But sometimes, When I'm driving late at night and I see a figure standing by the side of the road, I feel my heart start to race and my hands start to sweat. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of white in the ditches. A flash of a nightgown or the echo of laughter carried on the wind, and I know that she was telling the truth. She's still out there, waiting in the shadows, looking for the next driver who will be kind enough or foolish enough to stop and look and acknowledge her presence. And I know that one night, maybe years from now, maybe decades, I'll see her again, and I'm not sure what will happen when I do. The shadow that rode in my passenger seat from Silent Steve. They call me Silent Steve not because I don't talk, but because I prefer the quiet. The long empty hours on the highway when it's just me and the road and the rhythm of the miles passing beneath my wheels. I've always been comfortable with solitude, never needed the constant chatter of ACB radio or the artificial company of podcasts and audiobooks to keep me sane during those overnight hauls. But there was one trip when the silence became something else entirely, when the empty passenger seat beside me stopped being empty, and I learned that sometimes the scariest companion on a lonely road is the one you can't quite see. It started on a run from Denver to Omaha, hauling a load of refrigerated goods that needed to be delivered by dawn. I'd left late afternoon, timing it so I'd be driving through the night, when the roads were clearest and the temperatures were coolest for the refrigeration unit. The sun set somewhere around the Nebraska border, spilling orange and purple across the plains, in a display that never got old, no matter how many times I saw it. And then darkness settled in like a blanket, complete and total, broken only by my headlights and the occasional distant farmhouse light. I was about 2 hours into the dark stretch when I first felt it. A sensation like I wasn't alone in the cab anymore, like someone had quietly climbed into the passenger seat while I wasn't paying attention. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than fatigue playing tricks on my mind, the kind of false perception you get when you've been staring at the white lines on the highway for too long. But the feeling didn't go away. Instead, it grew stronger, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I glanced over at the passenger seat, expecting to see nothing, expecting to confirm that my mind was just a manufacturing company where none existed. But what I saw made my breath catch in my throat and my hands tighten on the wheel. There was something there, not solid enough to be called a shape, not empty enough to be called nothing, just a darkness that was slightly darker than the surrounding darkness, a shadow sitting in my passenger seat that seemed to absorb the light from my dashboard rather than reflecting it. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. Tried every rational explanation I could think of for what I was seeing. Maybe it was just the way the light was falling, creating an illusion of depth and presence where there was none. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, my brain filling in details that weren't really there. But when I looked again, the shadow was still there, and now it seemed like it was turned toward me, like it was watching me even though it had nothing I could identify as eyes. The temperature in the cab dropped suddenly, going from comfortable to cold in a matter of seconds, cold enough that I could see my breath forming clouds in the air in front of me. I reached for the heater controls, but my hand froze halfway there because the shadow had moved, leaning forward slightly like it was trying to get a better look at me, or maybe trying to get closer. I pulled my hand back and gripped the wheel with both hands, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. "This isn't real," I said out loud, hearing my voice for the first time in hours. And it sounded strange and small in the cold silence of the cab. "This is just exhaustion, just stress, just my imagination working overtime." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. This was something else, something that had decided to ride along with me. Something that filled my truck with a presence that felt ancient and patient and deeply, fundamentally wrong. The highway stretched out ahead of me, empty in both directions, as far as I could see, with no exits, no rest stops, no place to pull over and escape from whatever was sitting beside me. I thought about stopping anyway, about pulling onto the shoulder and getting out of the truck. But something told me that would be a mistake, that whatever this thing was, it wanted me to stop. wanted me to acknowledge it fully and give it my complete attention. So I kept driving, kept my eyes on the road, and tried not to look at the passenger seat even though I could feel the shadow there, watching me with whatever passed for its awareness. Then it started to move in ways that made my skin crawl. It flowed and shifted like smoke caught in a breeze, extending tendrils of darkness that reached toward me across the center console. I pressed myself back against the driver's side door, trying to put as much distance between us as possible in the confined space of the cab, and I felt one of those tendrils brush against my arm. Where it touched me, my skin went numb, not painful, but absent, like that part of me had stopped existing for a moment. "What do you want?" I heard myself ask, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound calm. The shadow didn't answer, at least not in words, but I felt something shift in the cab, a change in the pressure or the temperature, or maybe in reality itself. Images started to flash through my mind, visions that didn't belong to me, memories of roads I'd never driven and faces I'd never seen. I saw accidents, terrible crushing impacts that left metal twisted and lives extinguished. I saw drivers slumped over steering wheels, eyes closed in final sleep. I saw the highway at night from angles that suggested someone or something standing on the shoulder, watching the trucks pass by, waiting. I shook my head violently, trying to clear these visions away, trying to focus on the physical reality of the road in front of me. The white lines, the rumble strips, the distant taillights of a vehicle far ahead. These were real. These were solid. These were things I could hold on to. But the shadow kept pushing these images into my mind, and with them came emotions that weren't mine. Feelings of hunger and loneliness, and a desire so intense it felt like it might consume me from the inside out. That's when I understood what this thing wanted. It wanted a ride, yes, but not just in the physical sense. It wanted to experience being human, to feel what I felt, to see through my eyes and live through my actions. It was old and tired of existing alone in whatever dark spaces it normally inhabited, and it had chosen me, chosen this night, chosen this lonely stretch of highway to try and connect with something warm and alive. The realization didn't make me less afraid, but it did give me something to work with, some framework for understanding what was happening. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and I spoke to the shadow again. "I'm driving this truck," I said firmly. "I'm in control here. You can ride along if you need to, but you can't have me, can't take me over, can't make me into something I'm not. I'm going to Omaha, I'm going to deliver my load, and then I'm going to find some bright lights and other people and warm coffee. You can come along for the ride if you want, but those are my terms." For a long moment, nothing changed. The shadow remained still, the cold remained oppressive, and I thought maybe I'd made things worse by acknowledging it directly. But then, slowly, the temperature started to rise, the numbing cold retreating back to comfortable warmth. The shadow pulled its tendrils back, settling more firmly into the passenger seat, and while it didn't disappear, it stopped trying to reach toward me. It felt like we'd reached some kind of understanding, some unspoken agreement about the boundaries of this strange companionship. We drove like that for the next 3 hours, me and my shadow passenger, through the Nebraska darkness with nothing but the highway and the stars for company. Occasionally, I would feel it stir, feel those visions trying to push into my mind again. But they were gentler now, less invasive, more like memories being shared than experiences being forced. I saw centuries of roads, from dirt paths to paved highways, always from the perspective of something watching from the edges, never quite part of the journey, but always present for it. When I finally pulled into the delivery location in Omaha, just as dawn was breaking, washing the sky in shades of gold and rose, I looked over at the passenger seat and found it empty. The shadow was gone, vanished with the darkness, leaving behind only a bone-deep cold in that seat that took hours in the morning sun to fully dissipate. I completed my delivery, filed my paperwork, and found a diner where I sat in a booth by the window and drank coffee until the shaking in my hands finally stopped. I've thought about that night many times since then, wondered what exactly rode with me through the Nebraska darkness. Wondered if it was some kind of ghost, or spirit, or something else entirely that doesn't fit into any category I understand. I've driven that same route dozens of times since, and sometimes, especially on the darkest nights, I feel that same presence settling into my passenger seat, that same cold weight of something ancient and lonely looking for company on the endless highway. I don't welcome it, but I don't fight it either. We have our understanding now, my shadow passenger and I, and in the years since that first night, I've learned that it's a surprisingly good traveling companion, quiet and undemanding and content, just to watch the miles roll by through eyes that aren't its own. The truck stop where it's always 3:33 a.m. from Diesel Dan time is a strange thing when you're a long-haul driver. You watch the sun rise and set, you cross time zones and lose hours, or gain them back. You exist in a perpetual state of jet lag, where your body never quite knows what time it really is. But even with all that strangeness, I'd never experienced anything like the truck stop I found outside of Amarillo. The one where time didn't just feel wrong, it was wrong, frozen in a single moment that repeated endlessly, like a record skipping on the same groove. I'd been driving for 16 hours straight, pushing the limits of what was legal and well past what was safe. Running on nothing but gas station coffee and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from needing to make a delivery deadline that would mean the difference between paying my bills and falling behind. My eyes were burning, my back was aching, and every part of me was screaming for rest when I saw the truck stop signs promising fuel, food, and a place to park for the night. The exit ramp appeared suddenly, almost too suddenly, like it hadn't been there a moment before, but had materialized just when I needed it most. I took it without thinking too hard about it, too tired to question my good fortune, and followed the access road to a truck stop that looked like something out of the 1980s. All neon lights and chrome and big promises about hot showers and home-cooked meals. The parking lot was about half full, with rigs lined up in neat rows, and I found a spot near the back and pulled in, killing the engine with a sense of relief that went bone deep. I sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me, and that's when I noticed the first strange thing. Every single clock I could see, the one on my dashboard, the one on my phone, the digital display on my CB radio, all of them read exactly 3:33 in the morning. I figured it was just a coincidence. Maybe some kind of electromagnetic interference from all the trucks parked together. But something about it made me uneasy, in a way I couldn't quite name. I climbed down from my cab and stretched, feeling my spine pop and crack in ways that probably weren't healthy, and looked around the parking lot. The other trucks sat silent and dark, no movement visible in any of the cabs, no drivers walking to or from the building. It was like everyone had parked and then immediately fallen into the deepest sleep. And the stillness of it all felt wrong for a truck stop that should have been bustling with activity even at this hour. The building itself was lit up bright as day, fluorescent lights blazing through big windows that showed rows of merchandise and a counter, with a clerk standing behind it. I walked toward the entrance, my boots echoing on the pavement in a way that seemed too loud in the oppressive quiet, and pushed through the glass door expecting to hear the usual chime or bell. Instead, there was nothing. Just silence as the door swung open and I stepped inside. The clerk behind the counter looked up at me and smiled, but there was something mechanical about it. Something rehearsed and empty, like he was going through motions he'd performed 1,000 times before. "Welcome to the Night Owl truck stop," he said, and his voice had a flat quality to it, like he was reading from a script. "We're here to serve you 24/7. What can I help you with tonight?" "Coffee," I said, because that's what I always say when I walk into a truck stop, and I headed toward the coffee station near the back of the store. As I walked down the aisles, I noticed that everything was perfectly arranged, not a single item out of place, not a speck of dust on any of the shelves. It looked less like a working store and more like a display, a perfect recreation of what a truck stop should look like without any of the wear and tear that comes from actual use. I poured myself a cup of coffee from a pot that looked and smelled fresh, and when I took a sip, It tasted exactly the way truck stop coffee should taste. That perfect balance of bitter and burned that somehow becomes comforting when you've been drinking it for 20 years. I carried it to the counter to pay, and that's when I noticed the clock on the wall behind the clerk. It read 3:33, the second hand frozen in place between the 6 and the 7. "Your clock stopped," I said, pointing to it, and the clerk's smile never wavered. "Is it?" he asked, but he didn't turn to look. I hadn't noticed. "That'll be $2.50 for the coffee." I handed him a 5, and he made change with movements that were too precise, too measured, counting out the bills and coins and placing them in my hand with fingers that felt cold even through the brief contact. I took my change and my coffee and walked back outside, intending to return to my truck and get some sleep before hitting the road again. But as I stepped through the door and into the parking lot, something made me stop and look up at the sky. What I saw made my blood run cold. The stars were wrong. Not just in unfamiliar positions, but actually wrong. Frozen in place without the subtle movement you can see if you watch them long enough, without the slow rotation that comes from the Earth's spin. It was like looking at a photograph of the night sky rather than the real thing, and the moon hung in exactly the same position it had been in when I'd arrived, not having moved even a fraction of a degree. I pulled out my phone to check the time, and it still read 3:33. I watched the screen for a full minute, counting the seconds in my head, but the numbers never changed. The clock app was running. I could see the interface responding when I touched it, but time itself had stopped moving forward. Panic started to build in my chest. That tight feeling you get when you realize something is very wrong, but you don't yet understand what or why. I walked quickly back to my truck, my coffee forgotten and cooling in my hand, and climbed up into the cab. I tried the ignition, and the engine turned over, but wouldn't catch, coughing and sputtering like it had forgotten how to run. I tried again, and each time the result was the same. The engine almost starting, but never quite making it, like something was preventing it from coming to life. That's when I noticed the other trucks. I'd thought they were all dark and empty, but now I could see that wasn't quite true. In each cab, there was a faint glow, the kind of light that comes from a phone screen or a dashboard display. And if I looked very carefully, I could make out shapes sitting in the driver's seats. They weren't moving, weren't doing anything, just sitting there staring forward, with the same frozen stillness that seemed to have infected this entire place. I climbed back down from my truck, my heart pounding now, my breath coming fast and shallow, and I walked to the nearest rig. I knocked on the door, and the sound echoed across the parking lot, but there was no response from inside. I cupped my hands around my eyes and peered through the window, and what I saw made me stumble backward in horror. The driver was sitting in his seat, hands on the wheel, eyes open and staring straight ahead. But he wasn't moving, wasn't even breathing that I could see, and his skin had a waxy quality to it that reminded me of a mannequin. I ran to the next truck and found the same thing, and the next, and the next. Each one containing a driver frozen in place, like a statue, trapped in whatever moment they'd been living when time had stopped moving forward. I ran back toward the building, some desperate plan forming in my mind to confront the clerk, to demand answers, to find a way out of this nightmare. But as I got closer, I saw something through the windows that made me stop in my tracks. There were other people inside now, customers I hadn't seen before, and they were all standing perfectly still, in various positions throughout the store. One man was reaching for a candy bar, his hand suspended in midair. A woman was mid-step, one foot raised off the ground, frozen in the act of walking toward the counter, and the clerk stood behind his register with that same empty smile, as motionless as everything else. I backed away from the building, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening, trying to find some logical explanation for any of this. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't fit with the frozen silence of this place, a sound that suggested movement and life and the passage of time. It was an engine, distant but growing closer, and I turned toward the access road just in time to see headlights approaching. A truck was pulling into the parking lot, A big Kenworth hauling what looked like a load of construction equipment, and I felt a surge of hope that almost made me cry. Here was someone else, someone new, someone who might be able to help, or at least confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. I waved my arms, jumping up and down, trying to get the driver's attention as he pulled into a parking spot 3 spaces down from where I stood. The engine shut off, and I heard the door open. Saw a man climb down from the cab. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a gray beard and tired eyes, and he stretched and yawned and looked around the parking lot with the casual interest of someone who'd seen 1,000 truck stops, just like this one. "Hey," I called out to him, running over. "Hey, you need to listen to me. Something's wrong with this place. We need to leave right now." He looked at me with concern, the kind of look you give someone who seems like they might be having a breakdown, and he held up his hands in a calming gesture. "Easy there, buddy," he said. "What's got you so wound up?" I tried to explain, the words tumbling out too fast, about the frozen clocks, and the motionless drivers, and the stars that didn't move. But even as I spoke, I could see the skepticism growing in his expression. "The clocks all say 3:33, I finished desperately. "Check your phone, check your watch, check anything. It's all frozen at 3:33. He pulled out his phone with the patient air of someone humoring a crazy person, looked at the screen, and then showed it to me. It read 3:33, but instead of looking shocked or afraid, he just shrugged. "Huh, that's weird," he said. "Must be some kind of technical glitch, probably affecting the whole area. I'm sure it'll sort itself out." He started walking toward the building, and I grabbed his arm, trying to stop him. "No, you don't understand. There are people in there, frozen people, and the drivers in the trucks. They're not moving, they're not breathing. Something is keeping us all trapped here." He pulled his arm away from my grip, and now there was annoyance in his expression, along with the concern. "Look, I don't know what your problem is, but I've been driving for 14 hours, and I need coffee and a bathroom. You should probably get some sleep, friend. You look like you need it." I watched him walk into the building, watched through the window as he poured himself coffee and went to the counter to pay. Watched as he handed money to the clerk, who still wore that same mechanical smile. And then, as I stood there watching, I saw him slow down, saw his movements become more deliberate and measured, saw him freeze in the act of taking his change, his hand extended, his face blank. He'd become one of them, another frozen figure in this place where time had stopped, another driver trapped in an endless moment that would never move forward. And I realized with creeping dread that this was what would happen to me too if I stayed here. That whatever force was keeping this place locked at 3:33 would eventually catch up to me and lock me in place just like all the others. I had to leave. I had to find a way out. I ran back to my truck and tried the engine again, and this time, maybe because desperation gave me some kind of clarity, I noticed something I'd missed before. The clock on my dashboard was still frozen at 3:33, but my watch, the old mechanical one my grandfather had given me that didn't run on batteries or electronics, was still ticking. Time hadn't stopped everywhere, just in all the digital systems, just in all the things that connected to the infrastructure of this place. I looked at my watch and saw that it read 3:41, 8 minutes past the frozen moment that held everything else in its grip. 8 minutes that I'd experienced while everything around me remained locked in place. That meant time was still passing for me, at least for now, which meant I might still have a chance to escape before whatever was happening here claimed me too. I got out of my truck and looked around the parking lot with new eyes, looking for anything that might show me a way out. The access road was still there, still visible in the glow of the truck stop lights, and I made a decision that might have been brave, or might have been foolish, but felt like my only option. I started walking toward the exit, away from my truck, away from my livelihood, away from everything except the desperate need to escape this frozen moment. The walk felt like it took hours, even though my watch told me it was only minutes, and with every step, I expected to feel myself slowing down, feel my movements becoming sluggish and measured, and final. But I kept moving, kept putting one foot in front of the other, and eventually, I reached the end of the access road and stepped back onto the highway. The moment my feet touched the main road, everything changed. Sound rushed back in, the normal sounds of wind and distant traffic, and insects in the grass. The stars started moving again, resuming their slow eternal rotation, and when I checked my phone, the clock was running normally, the numbers ticking forward like they should. I looked back at the truck stop, and it was still there, still brightly lit, but now it seemed somehow less real, like a mirage or a memory, rather than an actual place. I flagged down a passing truck, and the driver was kind enough to give me a ride to the next town, where I called my company and reported my rig as abandoned. I told them I'd had some kind of medical emergency, which wasn't entirely a lie, given the state of my mental health after what I'd experienced. They weren't happy about it, but they sent someone to retrieve the truck, and when they did, they reported that they'd found it parked at an old abandoned truck stop that had been closed for 15 years. I never got my rig back, never found out what happened to all the drivers I'd seen frozen in their cabs. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if they're still there, still trapped in that single moment, still experiencing 3:33 a.m. on an endless loop while the world moves on without them. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed just a little bit longer, if I'd walked into that building one more time, if I'd let the frozen moment claim me like it claimed all the others. I don't drive anymore. Gave up the road after that night and found work in a warehouse where time moves normally and clocks actually count forward. But I still hear the stories from other drivers, rumors about a truck stop that appears when you need it most, when you're too tired to go on and desperate for a place to rest. They say the coffee's always fresh, and the parking is always available, and the clerk is always smiling. They say it's the perfect place to stop and take a break from the endless highway. And I never tell them what I know, never warn them about what they might find there, because I've learned that some truths are too strange to be believed, and sometimes the only thing you can do is save yourself and hope that others are lucky enough or smart enough to do the same. The woman who appeared in my mirror from Highway Hank. Mirrors are a truck driver's lifeline. The way we see the world behind us and beside us and all the places our eyes can't reach from the driver's seat. I've spent countless hours watching the road through my mirrors, checking blind spots and monitoring traffic and making sure my trailer stays where it's supposed to be. But after what happened on that run through West Virginia, I've developed a complicated relationship with reflective surfaces, a fear that makes me cover my mirrors when I park for the night and avoid looking at them any longer than absolutely necessary. It started on a foggy evening in late March, one of those nights when the mist hung so thick in the air that my headlights couldn't penetrate more than 20 feet ahead, turning the highway into a tunnel of white nothingness. I was hauling a load of furniture from North Carolina to Pittsburgh, running through the mountains on a route that twisted and turned like a snake, climbing and descending in ways that made my engine work hard and my brakes work harder. The fog had rolled in suddenly, going from clear skies to near zero visibility in the space of about 10 minutes, and I'd slowed way down, creeping along at 30 miles an hour with my flashers on and my nerves stretched tight. The radio had lost its signal somewhere back in the valleys, leaving me with nothing but static and the occasional fragment of a song or a voice before it dissolved back into white noise. I was checking my mirrors constantly, paranoid about other vehicles coming up behind me, too fast in the limited visibility. When I first saw her, she was in my passenger side mirror, standing on the shoulder of the road, visible for just a moment before the fog swallowed her up again. I caught a glimpse of a woman in a white dress, her hair hanging long and dark around her face, and my first instinct was to hit the brakes and check if she needed help. But something stopped me, some instinct that said this wasn't right. That a woman standing alone on a mountain highway in thick fog in the middle of nowhere didn't add up to any scenario that made sense. I kept driving, kept watching the mirror, and a few seconds later, she appeared again, in exactly the same position relative to my truck, even though I'd traveled several hundred feet. She was still standing on the shoulder, still wearing that white dress, still watching the road with an intensity I could feel, even though I couldn't see her face clearly. I told myself it was just a trick of the fog, multiple women who happened to be standing in similar spots, or maybe just the same woman reflected in some weird atmospheric phenomenon. But then I saw her in my driver's side mirror, on the opposite side of the road, in a position that should have been impossible if she was the same person I'd just seen on the passenger side. And this time, she was closer to the road, standing right at the edge where the pavement met the dirt. Close enough that I should have been able to hear her footsteps or see her moving. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I felt sweat starting to bead on my forehead, despite the cool air coming through the vents. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, refusing to look in the mirrors again, but I could feel her presence now, could sense her watching me from somewhere in the fog-shrouded darkness. The temperature in the cab started to drop, going from comfortable to cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the outside weather. Then, I heard it, a sound like fingernails on glass, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I jerked my head around to look at the sleeper berth, expecting to see someone or something back there, but it was empty. Just my rumpled sleeping bag and the bag of clothes I kept for emergencies. The scratching came again, and this time I realized it was coming from the mirrors themselves, like someone was dragging their nails across the reflective surface from the inside. I couldn't help it. I had to look, and when I did, she was in all three mirrors at once, in the driver's side and the passenger side and the wide center mirror that showed the road behind me. She was closer now, close enough that I could see her face, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Her eyes were completely black, no whites at all, just empty darkness that seemed to pull at something deep inside me. Her mouth was open in what might have been a smile, or might have been a scream, stretched too wide, showing teeth that looked too sharp to be human. She raised one hand and pressed it against the mirror, and I watched in horror as the glass started to ripple like water, like it was becoming liquid under her touch. Her hand pushed through, emerging from the mirror into the cab of my truck, pale fingers stretching toward me with nails that were long and black and curved like claws. I swerved instinctively, jerking the wheel to the left, and the truck responded sluggishly on the wet mountain road. I felt the trailer start to slide, felt the terrible sensation of losing control at 30 miles an hour on a road with guardrails that probably wouldn't stop a fully loaded semi from going over the edge. I fought the wheel, trying to regain control, and somewhere in the chaos of that moment, I screamed at the thing in my mirror, told it to leave me alone, to get out of my truck, to go back to whatever hell it had come from. The hand withdrew, pulling back through the rippling mirror, like it was being sucked into a drain, and suddenly I had control of the truck again. I straightened out, got all the wheels back on solid pavement, and took several shuddering breaths while my heart tried to beat its way out of my chest. I looked in the mirrors again, and she was gone, vanished like she'd never been there at all, leaving behind only the echo of that scratching sound and the memory of those terrible black eyes. I drove for another hour through the fog, fighting the urge to pull over and get out of the truck, knowing somehow that stopping would be the worst thing I could do. The fog finally started to clear as I descended the eastern slope of the mountains, and by the time I reached the outskirts of Pittsburgh, it was completely gone, replaced by a clear night sky full of stars. I pulled into a truck stop and sat in my cab for a long time, engine running, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep and the disorienting effect of driving through heavy fog. But when I finally worked up the courage to examine my mirrors closely, I found scratches on the glass. Thin lines that formed a pattern that looked almost like letters, almost like words, but in no alphabet I recognized. I had those mirrors replaced the next day, paid out of my own pocket to get new ones installed at a shop in Pittsburgh, but the scratches came back, appearing on the new mirrors after my next overnight haul. The same pattern, the same mysterious letters or symbols or whatever they were. I had the mirrors replaced again, and again they came back, and eventually I gave up trying to get rid of them. What I haven't given up on is figuring out what the woman wants, why she appears in my mirrors, why she chose me out of all the drivers on all the highways in the world. I've done research, talked to other drivers who've had strange experiences, visited libraries and searched online for any information about women in white dresses who appear to truckers on foggy mountain roads. I found a few similar stories, whispers and rumors about a hitchhiker ghost, or a woman who died in an accident and now haunts the highways looking for the driver who killed her. But none of those stories quite match what I experienced, and none of them explain the scratches, or the way she could push through the mirror into my cab, or those terrible black eyes that looked like they could see straight into my soul. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through dark stretches of highway, I see her again in my mirrors, always watching, always waiting. Never quite close enough to touch, but never far enough away to forget. I've learned to live with it, learned to drive with one eye on the road and one eye on my mirrors, learned to expect that scratching sound when I'm at my most tired and vulnerable. I've learned that she's more active on foggy nights and quiet roads, that she seems to feed on fear and isolation, that the best defense is to keep moving and never, ever stop when she appears. Other drivers have started to notice the scratches on my mirrors, ask me what they mean, if there's some kind of code or decoration. I tell them it's nothing, just damage from road debris, and I change the subject as quickly as possible. Because how do you explain to someone that you're being haunted by something that lives in reflective surfaces? Something that watches you from the other side of the glass, and sometimes reaches through to remind you that it's there. I still drive, still make my runs and my deliveries, still spend my nights on dark highways, with only the sound of my engine for company. But I've changed my routes when possible, avoiding the foggy mountain roads of West Virginia, taking the longer way around even if it costs me time and fuel. And when I absolutely have to drive through those mountains, I do it during the day when the sun is high and the visibility is clear and mirrors are just pieces of glass that show you what's behind you, instead of windows into something else entirely. Some nights, when I'm parked at a rest stop trying to sleep, I hear that scratching sound on my windows, slow and deliberate and patient. I've learned not to look, to keep my eyes closed and my breathing steady and wait for it to pass, because I know that if I look, I'll see her standing outside my truck, pressed against the glass. Those black eyes staring at me with an intensity that suggests she's waiting for something. Some moment of weakness when I'll let her in completely. I don't know what would happen if I did. Don't know what she would do if I acknowledged her fully and let her presence become more than just a reflection in my mirrors. And I never want to find out. So I keep driving, keep moving forward, and I try not to think too hard about the woman in white who has made my mirrors her home and my truck her hunting ground. The gas station clerk with no hands. From Rusty Joe. There are certain gas stations that every trucker knows to avoid. Places with reputations that get passed around on CB radios and in truck stop parking lots like warnings carved into bathroom stalls. But sometimes you don't know a place has a reputation until it's too late. Until you've already pulled in and shut off your engine, and found yourself face to face with something that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. That's what happened to me at a little gas station outside of Barstow, California. One of those places that looks like it might have been nice once, but has fallen into disrepair. With faded paint, and cracked concrete, and a general air of abandonment that should have told me to keep driving. But I was running on empty, literally and figuratively, with my fuel gauge showing less than an eighth of a tank, and my energy reserves depleted from 18 hours behind the wheel. It was a scorching afternoon in August, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and dance above the pavement, and I pulled up to the pumps with a sense of relief at having found anything at all in this stretch of desert wasteland. The station was old-fashioned, with pumps that looked like they dated back to the 70s, and a small building with windows so dusty I couldn't see inside. There were no other vehicles, no signs of life except for a flickering open sign that buzzed and sputtered in the heat. I climbed down from my cab, my shirt immediately sticking to my back in the oppressive heat, and approached the pump. It didn't have a credit card reader, which meant I'd have to go inside and prepay. So I trudged across the baking pavement toward the building, already dreading the interaction with whatever clerk was manning this isolated outpost. The door stuck when I tried to open it, swollen in its frame from the heat, and I had to push hard to get it to swing inward. Cool air rushed out, such a stark contrast to the outside temperature that it actually made me shiver, and I stepped into the dimly lit interior with a sense of gratitude for the air conditioning. The store was small and cramped, with aisles of dusty merchandise that looked like they'd been sitting on the shelves for years, and a counter in the back with an ancient cash register sitting on top of it. Behind the counter stood the clerk, and at first glance, there was nothing particularly unusual about him. He was middle-aged, balding, wearing a stained shirt with a name tag that read Earl, and he was staring at me with an expression that might have been boredom or might have been something else entirely. I walked up to the counter and told him I needed $50 on pump 2, and that's when I noticed. He didn't move his hands. He just stood there, arms hanging at his sides, and nodded at me. "Sure thing," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "50 on pump 2. I waited for him to work the register, to take my money, but he didn't move. He just kept standing there, arms at his sides, staring at me with eyes that were a little too wide, a little too unblinking. Do you need me to put the money on the counter?" I asked, pulling out my wallet. He nodded again, that same mechanical movement, and I placed a $50 bill on the scratched surface between us. Still, he didn't reach for it. He didn't move at all, except for his eyes, which tracked my movements with an intensity that was starting to make me uncomfortable. That's when I saw them, or rather, didn't see them. His arms ended at the wrists, just smooth stumps wrapped in old bandages that had yellowed with age. He had no hands, no fingers to make change, no palms to pick up money, no thumbs to press the buttons on the register. Just those wrapped stumps hanging uselessly at his sides while he stared at me with those two wide eyes. I felt my stomach turn over, felt a wave of revulsion mixed with pity wash over me, and I took a step back from the counter. "How do you, ... I started to ask, but the words died in my throat because he was smiling now, a slow spreading smile that showed teeth that were too gray, too numerous, too wrong. "Pump's ready," he said, though I hadn't heard him do anything to activate it. Hadn't seen him touch anything or move in any way that would explain how he'd processed my payment. "You can go fill up now." His voice had a quality to it that made my skin crawl. A sound like dry leaves rustling or insects clicking their mandibles together. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on him, watching as he remained perfectly still behind that counter with his handless arms hanging at his sides. "What happened to you?" I asked, not really wanting to know, but unable to stop myself from asking. His smile grew wider, impossibly wider, stretching across his face in a way that no human mouth should be able to stretch. "I gave them away," he said simply. "Sold them, actually, for a very good price. Would you like to make a purchase? I have many things for sale here, things you might need, things you might not know you need until it's too late." He gestured with one of his stumps toward the aisles behind me, and I turned to look, really look, at what was on those dusty shelves. What I saw made me wish I hadn't. The products weren't normal gas station fare. They were things that looked like they might be parts of people. Jars filled with liquid and floating objects that might have been organs or might have been something worse. There were boxes labeled with words I didn't recognize. Containers that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Packages wrapped in paper that looked like it was made from skin. "Everything has a price," Earl said behind me, and when I turned back to look at him, he was holding something in his stumps, cradling it between the bandaged ends of his arms like a precious treasure. It was a small box, wooden and old, with symbols carved into its surface. "Everything can be bought and sold. Your hands, your eyes, your voice, your memories. All of it has value to the right buyer." I ran then, didn't think about it or plan it, just turned and ran for the door, slamming into it hard enough to make it swing open despite being swollen in its frame. I stumbled out into the blazing heat and ran to my truck, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get the door open. I hauled myself up into the cab and turned the key, and the engine roared to life like it understood my desperation. I didn't care about the fuel I'd paid for. Didn't care about the $50 I'd left on that counter. Didn't care about anything except getting away from that place and that clerk and those shelves full of things that shouldn't exist. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of that parking lot, my trailer swaying dangerously as I accelerated too fast. But I didn't slow down until I was back on the highway with miles between me and that nightmare gas station. My fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, enough to get me to the next town, even though I knew for certain it had been showing less than an eighth when I pulled in. Somehow, impossibly, my truck had been filled, even though I'd never touched the pump, never put a drop of fuel in my tank. The $50 I'd given Earl had bought me gas, but what else had it bought? What price had I paid without knowing it? That was 6 months ago, and I still don't know the answer to that question. But I've noticed changes, small things that might be coincidence, or might be something worse. My hands have started to shake sometimes, tremors that come without warning and make it hard to grip the steering wheel. I drop things more than I used to, fumble with simple tasks that should be second nature. And sometimes, late at night, I feel a tingling in my fingers, a numbness that spreads up from my fingertips toward my palms, and I wonder if I'm slowly losing them, if they're being taken from me, piece by piece, as payment for that fuel I never pumped. I've tried to find that gas station again, driven the same stretch of highway between Barstow and Needles a dozen times, but I can't locate it. The exit doesn't exist, the building isn't there, and when I ask other drivers if they've seen it, they look at me like I'm crazy. Some of them tell me I must have dreamed it, that the heat and the exhaustion played tricks on my mind, but I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. And I know that somewhere out there in the desert, there's a gas station with a clerk who has no hands. A place where everything is for sale, and the prices are higher than money can measure. I know because I bought something there, paid for it without understanding the cost. And now I'm waiting to find out what I really traded away on that scorching afternoon in August, when I was desperate enough to stop at a place I should have known better than to enter. The thing under the ice from Iron Ike. It happened in late January, during one of those cold snaps where the temperature drops so far below zero that the air itself seems to solidify and breathing feels like inhaling knives. I was hauling a load of machine parts from Duluth to Fargo, taking a route that I'd driven 100 times before, following highways that cut through endless forests of pine and frozen lakes that stretched white and flat to the horizon. The storm hit me about 50 miles from my destination, coming out of nowhere the way winter storms do in that part of the country, going from clear skies to near zero visibility in less than 10 minutes. The wind picked up, howling like something alive and hungry, driving snow across the highway in sheets that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I slowed down, turned on my flashers, and prepared to wait it out, but the weather only got worse. That's when I made the mistake that nearly cost me everything. I was following what I thought was the highway, trusting my GPS and my instincts and years of experience, but somewhere in the whiteout, I missed a turn. By the time I realized I wasn't on the road anymore, I was already out on the ice, driving across the frozen surface of a lake that was big enough that I couldn't see the other side through the storm. My first instinct was panic, but I forced it down and tried to think rationally. The ice had to be thick, had to be solid, because my truck was still rolling smoothly without any cracking or breaking beneath the wheels. But I knew I needed to get off the lake as soon as possible, needed to find my way back to solid ground before something went wrong. I tried to turn around, but the steering felt sluggish and unresponsive, and I realized the ice beneath me was too slick, too perfect, and my wheels were finding no purchase. I was stuck out in the middle of a frozen lake in a blizzard, in a truck that weighed 40 tons, fully loaded, on ice that might or might not be thick enough to support my weight. That's when I felt it, a vibration that came up through the frame of the truck, a deep rumbling that had nothing to do with my engine. It felt like something was moving beneath me, something big and heavy, shifting its weight under the ice. I told myself it was just the natural settling and cracking that ice makes, the sounds of thermal expansion and contraction, but the vibration came again, stronger this time, accompanied by a sound like distant thunder. I put the truck in park and sat there, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. The storm was too severe to attempt walking to shore, even if I could figure out which direction shore was, but staying in the truck meant trusting that the ice would hold, that whatever was making those sounds beneath me wouldn't break through and drag me down into the freezing water. Then the ice around my truck started to glow, a soft blue-green light that seemed to come from deep below, from somewhere far beneath the surface. It was beautiful and terrifying, illuminating the falling snow and creating shadows that moved in ways that didn't make sense. I watched through my windshield as the glow grew brighter, pulsing in a rhythm that almost felt like breathing, and I understood with a cold certainty that whatever was down there knew I was here, was aware of my presence on the ice above it. The vibration came again, and this time I heard cracking, sharp reports like gunshots that echoed across the frozen expanse. I looked down and saw lines spreading across the ice beside my truck, fractures radiating outward from beneath my wheels, and I knew I was out of time. I had to move, had to try to drive to shore before the ice gave way completely, even if I had no idea which direction to go. I put the truck in gear and pressed gently on the accelerator, feeling the wheels spin uselessly for a moment before catching some traction. The truck lurched forward, and immediately I felt the ice beneath me shift and sag, felt the terrible sensation of weight pressing down on a surface that was no longer solid. The cracking sounds grew louder, more frequent, and the blue-green glow beneath the ice intensified, becoming almost blinding in its brightness. That's when I saw it, a shape moving beneath the ice, visible through the glow as a massive silhouette that was long and sinuous, like a serpent, but far too large to be anything natural. It moved alongside my truck, keeping pace even as I accelerated, and I could make out details now. Could see what looked like fins or spines running down its length, could see what might have been a head that was wider than my trailer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and my hands were locked on the wheel with a grip that made my knuckles ache. I drove faster, pushing the truck to speeds that were insane on ice, but the shape beneath me matched my speed easily, swimming through the dark water like it weighed nothing, and then it dove, disappearing from view, and the glow faded, leaving me in darkness, broken only by my headlights and the endless falling snow. For a moment, I thought maybe it had given up, maybe it had decided I wasn't worth the effort. But then I felt an impact from below, a massive strike that lifted my entire truck off the ice for just a second before we crashed back down. The ice beneath me shattered completely, and I felt my front wheels break through, felt the truck start to tilt forward into the freezing water. Time seemed to slow down, and I saw everything with perfect clarity, the water rushing up to meet my windshield, the ice fragments floating on the surface, the darkness below that seemed to go down forever. I was going to die here, going to sink to the bottom of this frozen lake in my truck, and no one would ever know what happened to me. But then, impossibly, the truck stopped sinking. Something was holding it up, something beneath the ice that had caught my trailer and was keeping me from going under completely. I could feel pressure from below, could feel whatever it was pushing upward against the weight of my truck, and I realized it wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to save me, or at least prevent me from sinking, though I couldn't imagine why. I threw open my door and jumped out onto the ice that was still intact around the back of my trailer, my boots sliding on the smooth surface. The truck was wedged in the broken ice at a 45-degree angle, front wheels submerged, but the back wheels still on solid surface. And beneath it, I could see the shape again. That massive form that had positioned itself under my trailer like a support pillar, using its own body to keep my truck from sinking. I ran, scrambling across the ice, toward what I hoped was shore, my breath coming in ragged gasps that froze in the air before they left my mouth. Behind me, I heard a massive splash as the thing finally let go, and my truck plunged completely through the ice. But I didn't look back. I just kept running until I hit snow-covered ground, until I felt dirt and rocks beneath the snow, until I knew I was safe on shore. I collapsed there, shaking from cold and fear and adrenaline, and I watched as the storm finally started to clear, the snow tapering off to reveal the lake stretching out before me. My truck was gone, completely submerged, but in the pre-dawn light, I could see something else. Out in the middle of the lake, the ice was glowing again with that same blue-green light, and I could make out a massive shape moving beneath the surface, circling slowly like it was searching for something. It took me 6 hours to walk to the nearest town, 6 hours of trudging through snow in temperatures that should have killed me, but somehow didn't. When I finally stumbled into a gas station and tried to explain what had happened, the locals just nodded knowingly. They told me about the lake, about the stories that went back generations, about something that lived in the deepest parts and only came to the surface in the dead of winter when the ice was thick. They called it the Guardian, said it protected the lake and the towns around it, saved ice fishermen who fell through, and guided lost travelers to shore. But they also said it demanded respect, required offerings, expected anyone who used the lake to understand that they were guests in its domain. And I understood then why it had saved me, why it had positioned itself beneath my truck and kept me from drowning. It was giving me a chance, one opportunity to leave its territory and never return. I never did go back to that lake, changed my route to avoid it even though it meant adding hours to my run between Duluth and Fargo. And I never got another truck, never went back to driving long haul after that night. Because I learned that there are places in this world where humans are tolerated, but not welcome, where ancient things still live and watch and enforce rules that we've forgotten we ever agreed to follow. And I learned that sometimes the scariest moments aren't the ones where something is trying to kill you, but the ones where something powerful enough to kill you chooses not to, and you're left wondering why, and what price you might still owe for your life. The passenger who left a bloody handprint from Freightliner Frank. I've picked up hitchhikers over the years. Despite all the warnings, and the company policies and the horror stories you hear from other drivers, sometimes you see someone standing on the side of the road, in the rain or the heat, thumb out and desperation in their eyes, and you just can't drive past without at least offering them a ride to the next town. Most of the time it's fine. Just ordinary people down on their luck who need a helping hand. And I've had some good conversations and heard some interesting stories from the folks I've given rides to. But there was one passenger who left more than just stories behind. One ride that ended with a bloody handprint on my dashboard that wouldn't wash away no matter how hard I tried. It was a Tuesday night in October, and I was running a load of automotive parts from Detroit to Indianapolis on a schedule that had me arriving just after midnight. The highway was nearly empty at that hour, just the occasional car passing in the opposite direction and the rare truck heading the same way I was. The night was clear and cool, perfect driving weather, and I was making good time when I saw him standing on the shoulder about a mile ahead, illuminated in my headlights like an actor on a stage. He was young, maybe early 20s, wearing jeans and a hoodie, and holding his thumb out in the universal gesture of someone looking for a ride. As I got closer, I could see that he looked clean-cut and normal, not like the dangerous types you're supposed to watch out for. And when our eyes met through my windshield, I saw something in his expression that made me ease off the gas and start pulling over. It was fear, pure and simple, The kind of terror that makes your pupils dilate and your skin go pale, and I recognized it because I'd felt it myself enough times to know it when I saw it. I brought my rig to a stop on the shoulder ahead of him, and he ran toward the passenger door. Actually ran, looking back over his shoulder like something was chasing him out of the darkness beyond the road. I reached across and opened the door for him, and he climbed up into the cab with movements that were jerky and panicked, slamming the door behind him and immediately locking it. "Thank you," he gasped, his breath coming fast and shallow. "Thank you so much. You have no idea. I've been walking for hours, and no one would stop, and I didn't know what I was going to do." His words tumbled out in a rush, running together, and I noticed that his hands were shaking where they gripped his knees. "It's okay," I told him, putting the truck back in gear and accelerating smoothly back onto the highway. "You're safe now. Where are you headed?" He told me he was trying to get to Indianapolis, said he'd had car trouble, and his phone had died, and he'd been stranded on this highway with no way to call for help. It was a plausible story, the kind of bad luck that could happen to anyone, but something about the way he told it felt off. His eyes kept darting to the mirrors, watching the road behind us, and he was sitting rigid in his seat, like he was braced for impact. "What happened?" I asked him, keeping my voice casual, even though I was starting to feel uneasy. "Did someone give you trouble out there?" He shook his head, but the movement was too quick, too emphatic. "No, nothing like that. I'm just cold and tired and stressed out. Car trouble is always a nightmare, you know." We drove in silence for a few minutes, and I noticed that he'd started to relax a little, his breathing evening out and his hands unclenching from his knees. But he still kept checking the mirrors, still watching the road behind us, with an intensity that suggested he was expecting to see something specific. I was about to ask him about it when he spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost contemplative. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, and the question was so unexpected that I glanced over at him in surprise. "I mean, do you think things happen for a reason, or is it all just random chance?" I shrugged, not sure where he was going with this. "I guess I believe we make our own fate mostly, but sometimes things happen that feel like more than coincidence." He nodded slowly, and in the glow from the dashboard lights, I could see that his face had gone even paler than before. "I did something bad," he said quietly. "Something really bad. And now I think something's following me. Something that wants to make sure I pay for what I did." The way he said it made my skin prickle, and I felt my hands tighten on the wheel. "What did you do?" I asked, not sure I wanted to hear the answer. He was silent for a long moment, just staring out the windshield at the highway stretching ahead of us. Then he reached up and pulled down his hood, and I saw that the back of his head was matted with blood, dark and wet in the dim light. "I killed someone," he whispered. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to, but they're dead, and it's my fault, and now I can't get away from it. I can feel it behind me, getting closer, and I know that when it catches up, I'm going to pay for what I did." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pull over and make this guy get out of my truck, to distance myself from whatever trouble he was bringing with him. But before I could say anything, before I could even start to slow down, I saw something in my rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing in the middle of the highway behind us, too far away to see clearly, but close enough that I could tell it was moving. Walking forward at a pace that shouldn't have been able to keep up with a truck traveling at 65 miles an hour, but somehow was. "Do you see it?" my passenger asked, his voice tight with terror. "Do you see what's following me?" I nodded, unable to speak, watching as the figure in my mirror grew larger, got closer, covering distance that should have been impossible. It was walking, just walking, but with each step it seemed to leap forward, to skip across the pavement in a way that defied physics and reason. "I'm sorry," my passenger said, and he was crying now, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have gotten in your truck. I shouldn't have brought this to you, but I was so scared and I thought maybe if I was moving it couldn't catch me." He reached up and placed his hand on my dashboard, and I saw that his palm was covered in blood, fresh blood that hadn't been there a moment before. It won't stop until it gets me. Nothing can stop it. I tried running, tried hiding, tried everything I could think of, but it always finds me. The figure in my mirror was close enough now that I could make out details, and what I saw made my stomach turn. It looked like a person, but wrong in every way that mattered. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, and where its face should have been there was just darkness, a void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was running now, covering the distance between us with impossible speed, and I knew with absolute certainty that it would catch up within seconds. "Get out," I told my passenger, my voice coming out harsh and panicked. "Get out of my truck right now." But he shook his head, and his hand pressed harder against the dashboard, leaving that bloody print that seemed to sink into the material like it was being absorbed. "It's too late," he said. "It's here." The temperature in the cab dropped so suddenly that frost formed on the windows, and I felt a presence behind me, something that had gotten into my truck even though the doors were closed and locked. I could smell it, a scent like old copper in decay, and I could hear breathing that wasn't coming from me or my passenger, slow and deliberate and far too close. My passenger screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the night like a knife, and then he was gone. Not out the door, not fallen to the floor, just gone, vanished from the seat beside me, like he'd never been there at all. The presence vanished with him, the temperature returned to normal, and I was alone in my cab on an empty highway, with nothing but the road ahead and the memory of what had just happened. I pulled over at the next exit, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the controls, and I sat there in the parking lot of a closed gas station trying to process what I'd experienced. I looked at the passenger seat, and there was no blood, no sign that anyone had been sitting there at all. But when I looked at my dashboard, the handprint was there, dark red against the black plastic, 5 fingers spread wide in what might have been a reaching gesture, or might have been a final desperate attempt to hold on to something solid. I tried to clean it off, used every cleaner I had in my truck, but the print wouldn't budge. It wasn't on the surface of the dashboard. It was in it, somehow merged with the material like it had become part of the truck itself. I had the dashboard replaced a week later, paid a mechanic to install a brand new one. But the handprint appeared on the new dashboard within hours, in exactly the same position, as permanent as a tattoo. That was 3 years ago, and the handprint is still there. A constant reminder of the night I picked up a passenger who brought something dark and hungry with him. I still drive, still make my runs and my deliveries, but I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore, no matter how desperate they look or how bad the weather is. Because I learned that night that some people carry burdens that can't be shared, debts that can't be paid, and consequences that will follow them no matter how fast they run or how far they travel. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through empty stretches of highway, I see figures standing on the shoulder with their thumbs out, and I feel a pull to stop, to offer help, to be the kind of person who doesn't leave someone stranded in the dark. But then I look at that handprint on my dashboard, at that bloody reminder of the passenger who vanished from my truck, and I keep my foot on the accelerator and my eyes on the road ahead. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I pass those figures without stopping, I see them in my rearview mirror, and they're not alone. There's something standing behind them, something tall and wrong with limbs too long and a face made of darkness. And I know that whatever debt my passenger owed, there are others out there owing similar debts, waiting on roadsides for someone kind or foolish enough to pick them up and give them a temporary escape from whatever is hunting them. I wonder sometimes what happened to him, the young man who climbed into my truck with terror in his eyes and blood on the back of his head. I wonder if the thing that was following him caught up, if it took him to wherever people go when they've done something unforgivable and run out of places to hide. I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, still running, still looking for rides from drivers who don't know better than to stop. But mostly I just drive, and I live with the handprint. And I try not to think too hard about the night I learned that some passengers leave marks that go deeper than just fingerprints. marks that become part of your truck and your life and your nightmares. Permanent reminders that the road is full of people, carrying darkness with them. And sometimes that darkness doesn't care about the difference between guilty and innocent, between the one who did wrong and the one who tried to help. The road sign that changed every mile from Outlaw Owen. Highway signs are supposed to be constants. Fixed points that tell you where you are, and where you're going, and how much farther you have to travel before you reach your destination. They're boring and reliable, and absolutely essential for navigation, especially on long overnight hauls when you're tired and the miles all start to blur together. But there's a stretch of highway in eastern Montana where the signs don't follow the rules, where they change and shift and show you things that can't possibly be real. And I learned about it the hard way on a cold night in November when I was running a load of electronics from Seattle to Minneapolis. I'd been driving for about 10 hours when I hit that stretch of Montana highway. One of those long straight roads that cut through endless plains with nothing but darkness on either side. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the landscape rolling away to the horizon. And I was making good time with the cruise control set, and my thoughts drifting in that semi-conscious state that long-haul drivers know well, where you're paying attention to the road but not really thinking about it. The first sign I noticed was a standard distance marker, the kind that tells you how far it is to the next few towns. It said Billings was 120 miles ahead, which matched what my GPS was showing, so I didn't think anything of it. But a mile later, I passed another sign, and this one said Billings was 130 miles ahead. I frowned at that, wondering if I'd misread the first sign, but I was pretty sure I'd seen it correctly. Another mile, another sign, and now Billings was 150 miles away. The number was going up instead of down, like I was driving away from my destination instead of toward it. I checked my GPS again, and it insisted I was on the right road, heading in the right direction. But the signs kept contradicting it. Every mile I drove, the distance to Billings increased by 10 or 20 miles, and I started to feel a creeping unease that had nothing to do with the late hour or the empty road. Then, the signs started showing towns that didn't exist, at least not according to my GPS or any map I'd ever seen. Welcome to Ashwood, population 3,427, read one sign. But there was no town visible from the road, just empty plains stretching away into darkness. Next services. Blackwater Junction, 15 miles, said another. But when I'd traveled 15 miles, there was nothing, just more empty highway, and another sign that said Blackwater Junction, 30 miles. I was fully alert now, all traces of drowsiness burned away by confusion and growing fear. Something was wrong with this stretch of road, something that went beyond simple vandalism or outdated signs. The numbers were changing in a pattern that felt deliberate, like someone or something was playing with me, leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. The next sign I passed made my heart skip a beat. It was a standard green highway sign, but instead of showing distances to real towns, it showed my name. Owen Patterson, 50 miles ahead, it read, using the name that appeared on my driver's license and my truck registration, but that I never used, preferring the nickname Outlaw Owen that I'd picked up years ago. How could a highway sign know my legal name? I slowed down, my hands tight on the wheel, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around, to backtrack until I found a different route, but I was in the middle of nowhere, with no obvious exits or alternate roads. The GPS still insisted I was on the correct highway, but the signs were telling a different story, and I didn't know which one to trust. Another mile, another sign. Owen Patterson, 40 miles ahead. The distance was counting down now, like I was approaching something, getting closer to some destination that bore my name. I felt sweat forming on my forehead despite the cool air in the cab, and my breath was coming faster, shallow, and anxious. The signs continued their countdown, each one decreasing the distance by 10 miles. 30 miles ahead, 20 miles ahead, 10 miles ahead, and then, when I should have reached whatever it was that bore my name, I saw a sign that made my blood run cold. Welcome to Patterson, Owen, population 1. There was still nothing visible from the road, no town or building, or any sign of human habitation. Just the endless dark plains and the highway cutting through them like a scar. And overhead the moon casting its pale light across a landscape that suddenly felt hostile and wrong. I kept driving because I didn't know what else to do, because stopping seemed even more dangerous than continuing forward. That's when the signs started showing dates. Patterson, Owen, founded 1847, read 1, which made no sense because I was born in 1975 and had certainly not founded any towns. Patterson, Owen, incorporated 1923, said another, and then Patterson, Owen, abandoned 1956. The dates were marching forward through history, and I realized they were telling a story, showing me the life cycle of a town that didn't exist, a place that bore my name but had somehow lived and died long before I was born. Then the signs changed again, and what they showed next made me want to scream. They started displaying dates from my own life, personal milestones that no one should have known, information that couldn't possibly appear on highway signs. Owen Patterson, born April 3, 1975, said 1. Owen Patterson, first truck route, June 1996, said another. They were chronicling my life, mile by mile, sign by sign, and each new marker revealed another detail that should have been private. Owen Patterson divorced, September 2001. Owen Patterson father, died January 2003. Owen Patterson bankruptcy filed, March 2008. Every failure, every loss, every moment I'd tried to forget was being displayed on these signs for anyone to see. Though there was no one else on this empty road, no witnesses except me, and whatever was orchestrating this nightmare. I wanted to close my eyes, to not see the next sign, but I couldn't look away. The signs kept coming, kept revealing, and they were moving forward through my life toward the present moment. Owen Patterson, current location, mile marker 247, November 15, 2022, 2:33 a.m. That was now, this exact moment, and seeing it written on a sign made me feel like I was caught in a trap, like my whole life had been leading to this point on this dark Montana highway. And then the signs started showing the future. Owen Patterson, engine failure, mile marker 250, 2:47 a.m. I looked at my odometer and saw I was at mile marker 248, which meant I was about to reach 250 in just a couple of minutes. I checked my engine gauges, and everything looked normal, but the sign had been specific, had given an exact location and time, and I felt a terrible certainty that it was telling the truth. I tried to slow down, tried to delay reaching mile marker 250, but my foot felt heavy on the accelerator, and the truck seemed to be pulling forward with its own momentum. The mile markers ticked by, 249, 249.5, and then 250. The clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m. exactly, and my engine coughed once, twice, and died. All power cutting out simultaneously as my truck coasted to a stop right at the marker. I sat there in the sudden silence, my truck dark and dead on an empty highway in the middle of nowhere, and I waited for whatever was supposed to happen next. The moon was still shining, the plains were still stretching away into darkness, and ahead of me, barely visible in the moonlight, I could see one more sign standing at the side of the road. I climbed down from my cab, my legs shaky and my heart pounding, and I walked toward that final sign. As I got closer, I could read what it said, and the words made everything else make a terrible kind of sense. Owen Patterson, choose your road, this mile, this moment, this choice. Below the main text were two arrows pointing in opposite directions. One pointed back the way I'd come, labeled Return to Known Roads. The other pointed forward into the darkness beyond my stalled truck, labeled Continue to Unknown Destinations. And I understood then that this wasn't just about signs or supernatural highways or some entity playing games with my life. It was about the choice every driver makes, every person makes, about whether to stick with the safe, familiar routes or to venture into territory that might lead somewhere new. I stood there for a long time, looking at that sign and thinking about my life, about all the choices I'd made that had led me to this moment. The divorces and the failures and the losses were real, but so were the small victories I'd had, the people I'd helped, the miles I'd covered, and the roads I'd seen. And I realized that whatever this place was, whatever was happening here, it was offering me something I'd never had before. A chance to see my life laid out clearly and decide if I wanted to continue on the same path or choose something different. I chose to go back. I walked to my truck, and when I turned the key, the engine started immediately, like it had never died at all. I turned around at the next crossroad I found, and I drove back the way I'd come, watching as the signs returned to normal, showing real towns with real distances that counted down properly as I traveled. By the time the sun rose and I crossed back into Wyoming, the whole experience felt like a dream, something that might have happened or might have been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But I know it was real, because I've changed since that night. I take different routes now, accept jobs I would have turned down before, talk to people I would have ignored. The signs showed me my whole life, past and present and possible future, and they gave me a choice about what to do with the time I have left. And every time I pass a highway sign now, I read it carefully, paying attention not just to the distances and the town names, but to what it might be trying to tell me about the road ahead and the choices I'll have to make. I've heard from other drivers who've encountered similar stretches of highway, places where the signs show things that shouldn't be possible, where reality bends and the road becomes something more than just pavement and paint. Some of them say it's dangerous, that you should avoid those roads at all costs, that nothing good comes from seeing too clearly into your own life. But I'm grateful for what I saw, for the choice I was given, even though it was terrifying and strange and completely unexplainable, because now I know that the road doesn't just go from one place to another. It goes from who you were to who you're going to become. And the signs along the way are there to help you navigate if you're willing to pay attention and brave enough to read what they're really saying. The voice in my CB that said "Don't look back" from Big Rig Bill. The CB radio is a truck driver's constant companion, a lifeline to other drivers, and a source of information about road conditions, traffic, and weather. I've been listening to CB chatter for 30 years, heard everything from mundane conversations about where to find the best coffee, to emergency calls for help from drivers in serious trouble. But I'd never heard anything like the voice that came through my speakers on a foggy night in Louisiana, a voice that gave me a warning I didn't understand until it was almost too late. I was hauling a load of furniture from Houston to Atlanta, running through Louisiana on Highway 10 through some of the most isolated territory I'd ever seen. The fog had rolled in around sunset, thick and gray and smelling of swamp water and decay, reducing visibility to almost nothing and forcing me to slow to a crawl. My CB was on, tuned to channel 19 like always, but it had been silent for the past hour, not even the usual static and crosstalk that you get when you're between major cities. That's when the voice came through. Clear and strong, despite the fog and the isolation, speaking in a tone that was calm and matter-of-fact, but somehow deeply unsettling. Driver heading east on I-10, mile marker 237, don't look back. The voice was male, older, with an accent I couldn't quite place. Somewhere between Southern and something else entirely. Don't look in your mirrors. Don't turn around. Just keep your eyes forward and keep driving. I grabbed my mic, pressed the talk button, and asked who was speaking, what they were talking about, but there was no response. Just silence. And then the voice came again, repeating the same message. Don't look back. Keep your eyes forward. Whatever you do, don't look in your mirrors. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt my hands tighten on the wheel. The natural human instinct when someone tells you not to look at something is to immediately want to look, to see what's so important that it requires a warning. My eyes drifted toward the rearview mirror, and I saw fog. Just endless gray fog filling the space behind my truck, so thick that I couldn't see my own trailer in the mirror. The voice spoke again, and this time there was urgency in it. I said, "Don't look back, driver. There's something in that fog behind you, something that gets stronger the more attention you give it. Keep your eyes on the road ahead, and don't acknowledge what's behind you." My heart was pounding now, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to check my mirrors, to see what was back there, to understand what I was supposed to be avoiding. But something in that voice, some quality of absolute certainty, made me resist the urge. I fixed my eyes on the road ahead, on the small patch of pavement illuminated by my headlights, and I tried not to think about the mirrors or what might be visible in them. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, pressing in closer to my truck, and I could hear sounds that didn't belong to the highway or my engine. Whispers, faint and indistinct, seeming to come from all around me. Scratching sounds like fingernails on metal, moving along the sides of my trailer. And underneath it all, a low rumbling that felt like it was coming from deep underground, vibrating through my seat and into my bones. The voice in my CB spoke again. "Good. You're doing good. Keep those eyes forward. The fog is trying to get your attention, trying to make you look back. It feeds on fear and curiosity, gets stronger every time someone acknowledges it. Just a few more miles, and you'll be clear of it." "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound calm. "What's in the fog?" There was a pause, and then the voice answered, and what it said made my blood run cold. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's the spirits of drivers who died on this stretch of road, trapped in the fog and looking for company. Some say it's something older than the highway, something that lived in these swamps before the road was built and resents the intrusion. All I know is that everyone who's looked directly at it, everyone who's acknowledged it fully, has either disappeared or gone mad from what they saw." I wanted to ask how the voice knew all this, who was speaking and how they knew I needed the warning. But I was afraid to take my attention off the road, even for the second it would take to key the mic. The whispers were getting louder, forming words I could almost understand, and the scratching sounds had moved to my cab, running along my door and window like something was trying to find a way inside. Then I felt it, a presence in my truck, something that had gotten into the cab even though the doors were closed and the windows were up. The temperature dropped suddenly, cold enough that I could see my breath, and I smelled that swamp smell, stronger now, rot and mold and stagnant water. Something touched my shoulder, a cold pressure that felt like fingers, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around and see what was there. "Eyes forward," the voice in my CB commanded, sharp and urgent. "Don't turn around, don't look at it, don't give it what it wants. It can't hurt you if you don't acknowledge it. Just keep driving, and it will pass." I gritted my teeth and kept my eyes locked on the road, even as the presence in my cab grew stronger, even as I felt cold breath on the back of my neck and heard whispers directly in my ear speaking in languages I didn't recognize. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my whole body trembling with the effort of not turning around, not looking, not giving in to the overwhelming need to see what was sharing my cab with me. And then, suddenly, it was gone. The presence vanished, the cold evaporated, and the fog outside my windows began to thin, breaking up into wisps that blew away on a wind I couldn't feel. Within minutes, I was driving under clear skies with stars visible overhead, the highway stretching out normal and mundane ahead of me. The voice in my CB spoke one last time. "You did good, driver. You listened and you survived. Not everyone does. There are places on these highways where the normal rules don't apply, where things from other times and other worlds press close to our reality. You found one tonight, and you got through it because you trusted the warning. Remember that sometimes the best thing you can do is keep your eyes forward and don't look back, no matter how much you want to understand." "Who are you?" I asked, but there was no answer. The CB fell silent, returning to its normal static and occasional chatter from other drivers who were miles away and completely unaware of what I'd just experienced. I tried calling out again, asking if anyone had heard the voice, but no one responded. It was like the conversation had never happened, like I'd imagined the whole thing, but I know I didn't imagine it. I know, because when I finally stopped for the night at a truck stop outside Baton Rouge and inspected my truck, I found scratches on my trailer, long, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by fingernails or claws. And when I looked at my cab, at the window beside my driver's seat, I found a handprint on the glass. A print made by a hand that was too large and had too many fingers, pressed against the outside of my window from the inside, which should have been impossible. I never found out who the voice belonged to, never got an explanation for how they knew I needed the warning, or how they knew exactly where I was on that empty stretch of highway. But I've been grateful for it every day since. Grateful that someone, or something, was watching and willing to help. Willing to guide me through a danger I couldn't see and barely understood. I still drive that route sometimes, still haul loads through Louisiana on Highway 10. But I always make sure to pass through that section during the day when the sun is high and the fog can't gather. And I keep my CB on channel 19 all the time now, listening for that voice, hoping that if I ever encounter another situation like that foggy night, someone will be there to warn me again, to remind me to keep my eyes forward and don't look back. Because I learned that night that there are guardians on these highways, people or entities who watch over drivers and offer protection when they can. And I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust a warning from a stranger and resist the urge to understand everything you encounter. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some things are safer unseen, and sometimes the voice on your CB that tells you not to look back is the only thing standing between you and a fate worse than anything you can imagine. The frozen rest stop with a burning smell from Mudflap Marty. Temperature is one of those things you take for granted until it goes wrong. Until you find yourself in a place where the thermometer is reading one thing, but your body is experiencing something completely different. That's what happened to me at a rest stop in Wyoming during what should have been a mild autumn evening, but turned into one of the strangest and most terrifying experiences of my long career on the road. I'd been driving through Wyoming on Interstate 80, hauling a load of machine parts from Salt Lake City to Omaha, making good time on a clear night with a forecast that promised nothing more challenging than maybe some wind in the mountain passes. The rest stop appeared right when I needed it. One of those official state-run facilities, with bathrooms and picnic tables and vending machines, all lit up bright under security lights that made it look safe and welcoming. I pulled in around 10 at night, parked in a spot near the building, and climbed down from my cab, stretching muscles that had been cramped from sitting for too many hours. The first thing I noticed was the temperature, or rather, the strange contradiction between what I was seeing and what I was feeling. The dashboard thermometer in my truck had read 52 degrees, comfortable autumn weather. But the moment I stepped outside, I was hit with cold that felt like midwinter. The kind of bone-deep chill that comes with temperatures well below freezing. I looked around, confused, and saw that frost was forming on the ground, on the picnic tables, on the windows of the rest stop building. My breath came out in clouds of vapor, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket and my jeans, making my fingers ache and my nose burn. But the sky was clear, the stars were bright, and nothing about the night should have produced this kind of cold. That's when I smelled it. A scent that didn't belong in a frozen environment, didn't belong anywhere really. It was the smell of something burning, acrid and chemical, like plastic or rubber melting in a fire. I looked around for the source, expecting to see smoke or flames, but there was nothing visible, just that overwhelming smell getting stronger with every breath. I walked toward the rest stop building, thinking maybe someone had started a trash fire, or there was an electrical problem. But as I got closer, the cold intensified and the burning smell grew overpowering. The door to the building was covered in frost, ice crystals spreading across the glass in intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like they were forming shapes or symbols. I pulled the door open, and what I found inside made no sense at all. The building should have been warmer than the outside, should have had heating running this time of year, but instead it was even colder, cold enough that ice had formed on the floors and walls, turning the whole interior into something like a walk-in freezer. And throughout it all, That burning smell persisted, stronger than ever, filling my nose and throat with an acrid taste that made me want to cough. The lights were on, fluorescent tubes buzzing and flickering overhead, casting a harsh white glow over everything. The bathroom doors stood open, and I could see ice covering the sinks and toilets, icicles hanging from the faucets. The vending machines were dark, their screens black, and frost covered their glass fronts so thick I couldn't see what was inside them. That's when I saw the footprints. They were on the floor, pressed into the ice, leading from the entrance deeper into the building toward the bathrooms. They looked like normal shoe prints, maybe size 10 or 11, but there was something wrong about them. They were smoking, actually giving off thin wisps of vapor or steam, and where they touched the ice, the floor was scorched black, burned in the shape of footprints. I followed them with my eyes, not daring to actually walk down that hallway, and I saw that they led to one of the bathroom stalls. The door was closed, and from underneath it, I could see a faint orange glow, like firelight, and more of that smoke or steam was seeping out, pooling on the floor and spreading across the ice. Every instinct I had was telling me to leave, to get back in my truck and drive away from this impossible place, where everything was frozen, but something was burning, where the laws of physics seemed to have been suspended. But I was frozen too, not from the cold, but from shock and fear, and a terrible curiosity about what could be, producing that orange glow behind the bathroom door. That's when I heard the voice, coming from inside that stall, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood the meaning of. It was talking about payment, about debts that needed to be settled, about the price of warmth and the cost of shelter. And I realized with dawning horror that this rest stop wasn't empty, that something was here, something that was both freezing and burning simultaneously, something that existed in two contradictory states at once. The bathroom door started to open, slowly, the hinges creaking in the frozen air, and I saw a hand push it outward. The hand was normal looking at first glance, human-sized and shaped, but as it moved into the light, I saw that it was covered in frost on one side and charred black on the other, like it had been simultaneously frozen and burned, existing in both states without choosing one or the other. I ran. I didn't think about it, or plan it, or try to be brave. I just turned and sprinted for the exit, my boots slipping on the ice but somehow keeping me upright. I crashed through the door and into the parking lot, and the moment I was outside, the temperature returned to normal, the cold vanishing like it had never been there. I looked back at the building, and the frost on the windows was gone. The ice on the ground melted, and everything looked ordinary and normal under the security lights. But I could still smell the burning, still feel the memory of that terrible cold, and when I looked down at my hands, I saw that my fingers were red and raw like they'd been frostbitten, and the tips of them were singed black like I'd touched something hot enough to burn. Both at once, impossible, but real. A physical reminder that what I'd experienced inside that rest stop had been actual and not imagined. I got back in my truck without using the bathroom, without getting the coffee I'd wanted, without doing any of the things I'd stopped for. I just climbed into my cab and started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, putting distance between myself and that frozen burning rest stop as fast as I could. I've thought about that night many times since then, tried to make sense of what I experienced, tried to find some logical explanation for a place that was both frozen and burning. The best I've been able to come up with is that I stumbled into somewhere that wasn't quite real, a space that existed between normal reality and something else, where the rules we take for granted don't apply, and opposites can exist simultaneously. I've driven past that rest stop dozens of times since then, and it always looks normal during the day, with families having picnics, and travelers using the facilities, and everything functioning the way a rest stop should. But I've never stopped there again, especially not at night, and I never will, because I know what's waiting there after dark. What exists in that building when the sun goes down and ordinary people drive past without realizing what they're passing? There are places on these highways that aren't quite part of our world, places where reality is thinner and strange things can push through into our space. That rest stop is one of them, a frozen burning threshold between here and somewhere else. And the only smart thing to do is recognize it for what it is and keep driving. Find another place to stop, another bathroom to use, another vending machine to get your coffee from, and if you ever find yourself at a rest stop where the temperature doesn't match the weather forecast, where you're freezing but you smell something burning, where the ice on the floor is smoking and there are scorched footprints leading deeper into the building, do what I should have done immediately. Get back in your truck and leave. Don't investigate. Don't try to understand. Don't follow the footprints to see what's making them. Just leave, and be grateful that you recognized the warning signs before it was too late. The town where the lights follow you from Silent Sam. Some towns you drive through barely register in your memory. Just another cluster of buildings and streetlights that blur together with 1,000 others you've passed over the years. But there was one town in rural Arkansas that I'll never forget. A place where the streetlights didn't just illuminate the roads but seemed to track your movement. Like living things with minds of their own and purposes I never wanted to understand. I was running a load of agricultural equipment from Memphis to Little Rock, taking a shortcut through some back roads to avoid construction on the main highway. It was well past midnight when I entered the town. A small place called Meridian that wasn't on my GPS and didn't appear on any map I'd checked before leaving. The town just appeared out of the darkness, materialized from nothing like it had been waiting for me to find it. The first thing I noticed was the streetlights. They were old-fashioned, the tall iron poles with curved tops that you see in historical districts, and they gave off a yellowish light that seemed somehow thicker than normal illumination, almost viscous, like the light had weight and substance. As my truck passed under the first one, the light seemed to intensify, brightening from dim yellow to brilliant white, so bright that it hurt my eyes and I had to squint against the glare. I thought it was just a coincidence, maybe a motion sensor triggering the light to full power, but then I passed the second streetlight and it did the same thing, dim yellow, until I got close, then flaring to brilliant white, tracking my truck as I moved beneath it. And as I pulled away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw that the light didn't dim back down. It stayed bright, and it swiveled on its pole, the lamp housing rotating to point in my direction, following me even though I was already half a block away. I felt unease creeping up my spine, that primitive recognition of being watched by something that shouldn't be able to watch. I pressed on through the town, and every streetlight I passed repeated the pattern, brightening as I approached, swiveling to follow me as I passed, creating a trail of brilliant white lights behind me that all pointed in my direction like accusing fingers or searchlights, tracking an escaped prisoner. The town itself was completely dark except for those lights. No windows showed any illumination, no porch lights were on, no signs glowed in store windows. The buildings were all old, Victorian-era architecture with elaborate trim and steep roofs, but they looked abandoned, empty shells that hadn't been occupied in years. The streets were clean and well-maintained, but there were no cars parked anywhere, no signs of life at all. I tried to accelerate, to get through this strange town as quickly as possible, but my truck seemed to be moving slower than it should, like I was driving through something thicker than air, some resistance that made every mile take twice as long as normal. And all the while, the streetlights kept tracking me, kept following my progress with that eerie swiveling motion that should have been impossible for lights mounted on fixed poles. Then I saw the figure standing under one of the streetlights ahead, right in the middle of the road. It was person-shaped, roughly human-sized, but it was made of light, or seemed to be made of light, glowing from within, with that same yellowish color the streetlights had been before they brightened. As I got closer, the figure raised one arm and pointed at me, and the streetlight above it flared so bright that I had to shield my eyes. I swerved to avoid the figure, and my truck fishtailed on the pavement, trailer swinging wide, before I regained control. When I looked back, the figure was gone, vanished like it had been switched off. But the streetlight it had been standing under was now following my truck with the same intensity as all the others. More figures started to appear, standing under different streetlights throughout the town, all made of that glowing yellow light, all pointing at me as I passed. Some of them moved, taking jerky steps toward my truck, but they never got close enough to touch. They just watched and pointed and followed me with their eyeless faces that were somehow still clearly focused on me and my truck. I grabbed my CB radio and called out, asking if anyone else was seeing this, if anyone else had driven through this town, but I got only static in response. The radio wasn't picking up any channels, wasn't connecting to anything. Like the town existed in some kind of bubble where normal communications couldn't penetrate. That's when I noticed the town was getting bigger. I'd been driving for what felt like 10 minutes, which should have been enough to cross a small town twice over. But I was still surrounded by those Victorian buildings, still passing under those tracking streetlights, still seeing those glowing figures pointing at me from the darkness. The town was expanding around me, stretching out, refusing to let me reach its end. Panic started to build in my chest, a tight feeling that made breathing difficult. I was trapped in this impossible town, surrounded by lights that followed me and figures made of illumination that watched my every move. I pushed the accelerator harder, trying to force my truck to go faster, despite the resistance I felt, and the engine roared in protest, but I didn't care. I needed to escape, needed to find the edge of this place before something worse happened. The streetlights began to pulse now, all of them synchronized, brightening and dimming in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat or maybe like breathing. The figures multiplied, appearing under every light, dozens of them, then hundreds, all pointing at me, all tracking my movement, and the buildings on either side started to lean inward, tilting toward the street, toward my truck, like they were trying to close in and trap me completely. I saw it then, a gap between two buildings that showed darkness beyond, real darkness, without those yellow streetlights, an alley or a side street that might lead out of this nightmare. I yanked the wheel and turned hard, my trailer barely making the corner, scraping against a building with a screech of metal on brick. But I made it. I got into that alley, and I gunned the engine, racing toward the darkness at the far end. The streetlights in the alley tried to follow, tried to swivel and track me, but there were fewer of them here, and they couldn't keep up with my speed. The figures appeared, tried to block my path, but I drove right through them and they burst like soap bubbles, dissolving into mist that smelled like ozone and old electricity. And then I was out, bursting from the alley onto a normal highway, with normal streetlights that stayed fixed in place and didn't track anything. The town of Meridian vanished behind me, and when I checked my mirrors, I saw only empty roads stretching back into darkness. No Victorian buildings, no following lights, no town at all. I pulled over at the next rest area I found and sat there shaking for half an hour, trying to process what I'd experienced. I checked my maps, my GPS, every navigation tool I had, looking for any mention of a town called Meridian in that part of Arkansas. Nothing, no record, no listing, no acknowledgement that such a place existed. But I know it exists, or existed, or exists, in some state between real and not real that I don't have words to describe. I know because when I got out to inspect my truck, I found marks on the trailer where it had scraped that building, long scratches in the metal that glowed faintly yellow in the darkness, like they'd been made by something that was part light and part solid matter. Those scratches faded over the next few days, dimming gradually until they were gone completely. But I'll never forget them, and I'll never forget that town. The place where the streetlights followed me, and figures made of illumination watched my passage through their impossible streets. I've talked to other drivers since then, asked if anyone else has encountered Meridian, or a town like it. Most look at me like I'm crazy, but a few, a very few, get a distant look in their eyes and change the subject. And I know they've seen it too. Driven through that town where the lights follow you and the buildings lean in and time stretches out, so a small town becomes endless. I still take shortcuts sometimes, still drive back roads when the main highways are clogged or closed. But I'm more careful now about the towns I pass through, more attentive to the streetlights and how they behave. Because I learned that night that not all towns are places where people live and work and go about normal lives. Some towns are traps, or tests, or maybe just places where reality works differently, and the familiar rules we depend on don't apply. And if you ever find yourself driving through a town where the streetlights seem to brighten as you approach, where they swivel to follow your movement, where figures made of light stand in the roads and point at you as you pass, don't slow down. Don't stop. Don't try to understand what's happening or why. Just find a way out, any way out, and drive until you're back on a normal road with normal lights that stay where they're supposed to be. Because some towns don't want you to leave. Some places are designed to keep you driving in circles forever. And the only way to escape is to recognize what's happening and refuse to accept it. To push through the resistance and the fear and the impossibility until you find the edge and break free into the normal world again. The radio host who said my name, from Diesel Dave, late night radio has always been a companion to long-haul drivers. Those voices in the darkness that make you feel less alone when you're the only vehicle on a 100-mile stretch of empty highway. I've listened to talk shows and music programs, news broadcasts, and call-in shows, finding comfort in the human connection even when it's one-sided and mediated through speakers and radio waves. But there was one night in New Mexico when the radio voice wasn't just a distant broadcaster talking to an anonymous audience, when it became something personal and specific and deeply unsettling. I was hauling a load of construction materials from Phoenix to Albuquerque, running through the desert on Interstate 40 in the dead hours between midnight and dawn. The landscape was nothing but darkness punctuated by the occasional distant light, miles of empty space where the stars overhead were brighter than anything on the ground. My radio was tuned to a station out of Flagstaff, some late-night talk show where a host with a smooth baritone voice was discussing conspiracy theories and unexplained phenomena with callers from around the country. The topics were the usual fare for that kind of show: UFO sightings and government cover-ups, and mysterious disappearances in national parks. I was only half listening, more focused on the road and my thoughts than on what was being said. But then the host said something that made me snap to full attention. "We have a special caller tonight. Someone who's been trying to reach us for a very long time. David, are you out there? David Morrison, driving east on I-40. Are you listening? My name is David Morrison. I go by Diesel Dave on the CB, and with other drivers, but my legal name, the name on my license, and my birth certificate, is David Morrison. And I was driving east on I-40, exactly as the host had said. I felt ice water run through my veins, felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. David, I know you can hear me," the host continued, his voice taking on a quality that was less broadcast smooth and more intimate, like he was talking directly to me instead of to thousands of listeners. "You've been running from something for a long time now, haven't you? Running from a choice you made, a decision you've regretted ever since. But tonight, David, tonight you're going to have to face it." I grabbed for the radio dial, tried to change the station, but it wouldn't move. It was stuck on this frequency, locked in place no matter how hard I twisted it. I tried turning the radio off completely, but it stayed on, the host's voice continuing to pour from the speakers like he was inside my cab with me. "Don't try to turn me off. David, you need to hear this. You need to understand what's coming for you. What's been coming for you since that night 5 years ago, when you made the choice to keep driving, to not stop, to pretend you didn't see what was happening on that roadside in Oklahoma." My stomach dropped, and I felt bile rise in my throat. 5 years ago, I had been driving through Oklahoma in a storm, rain coming down so hard I could barely see the road. I'd passed what looked like an accident, a car in the ditch with its hazard lights flashing, but I hadn't stopped. I'd told myself someone else would help, that I was running late and couldn't afford the delay, that it probably wasn't as serious as it looked. I'd driven past, and I'd tried never to think about it again. "But you have thought about it, haven't you, David?" the host said, like he could hear my thoughts. You've wondered what happened to the person in that car. Wondered if they survived, if they got help, if your decision to keep driving made the difference between life and death. And now you're going to find out. Up ahead, I saw lights on the side of the road, hazard lights flashing in the darkness. A car in the ditch, exactly like the one I'd passed 5 years ago, in the exact same position. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short gasps, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to not stop, to keep driving just like I had before. "This is your second chance, David," the host said, his voice soft and almost kind. "This is the universe giving you an opportunity to make a different choice, to be the person you wish you'd been that night in Oklahoma. But you need to understand something. If you stop, if you help, you'll see things you can't unsee. You'll know things you can't unknow. The easy path is to keep driving, to tell yourself it's not your problem, to live with the regret and the wondering. The hard path is to stop and face the consequences of your first choice." I was almost at the car now, close enough to see that it was the same make and model as the one from 5 years ago. Close enough to see a figure slumped over the steering wheel inside. Every fiber of my being wanted to keep going, wanted to avoid whatever nightmare was waiting for me if I stopped. But I thought about the person I'd been 5 years ago. The person who had chosen convenience over compassion, and I knew I couldn't be that person again. I pulled over, put my truck in park, and climbed down from the cab with legs that felt like they might give out beneath me. The radio in my truck continued playing, the host's voice following me. "Good choice, David. Brave choice. Now you're going to learn the truth." I approached the car slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The figure in the driver's seat was a woman, middle-aged, unconscious, or asleep, or something worse. I pulled on the door handle, and it opened easily, and I leaned in to check if she was breathing, if she needed help, if I was too late. Her eyes opened suddenly, snapping to focus on me with an intensity that made me stumble backward. But they weren't angry or accusing eyes. They were grateful, relieved, filled with tears that started to stream down her face. "You came back," she whispered. "I knew you would come back eventually. I've been waiting here every night for 5 years, waiting for you to make the right choice." I felt reality bend around those words, felt the impossibility of them crash into my understanding of how the world works. "That's not possible," I said, but she just smiled and shook her head. "Time works differently for those of us caught between choices. David, I've been here, in this moment, waiting for you to stop, waiting for you to be brave enough to help. And now you have, and now I can finally move on, and now you can finally forgive yourself." She reached out and took my hand, and her fingers were solid and warm and absolutely real. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for stopping." And then she was gone, vanished from the car like she'd never been there, leaving behind only an empty vehicle and the echo of her words. I walked back to my truck in a daze, climbed into the cab, and sat there staring at the dashboard. The radio was still on, but the host was no longer talking about me. He'd moved on to other topics, other callers, like the personal conversation had never happened. I tried to make sense of what I'd experienced, tried to fit it into some framework of reality that made sense, but I couldn't. All I knew was that I'd been given a second chance, an opportunity to make a different choice, and I'd taken it. Whether the woman had been real, or a ghost, or some kind of manifestation of my own guilt, didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd stopped, I'd helped. I'd chosen to be the person I wanted to be, instead of the person I was afraid of becoming. I still drive long haul, still cover thousands of miles every week, through every state in the country. But I stop now when I see cars in distress, when I see people who need help, when I have the opportunity to make a choice between convenience and compassion. Because I learned that night that the voices on the radio might know more about us than we think, that the universe sometimes gives us second chances, and that the choices we make define us in ways that echo long after the moment has passed. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through empty stretches of highway, I still hear that host's voice on my radio. talking about unexplained phenomena and mysterious encounters. But he never says my name again, never calls me out specifically, and I take that as a sign that I made the right choice, that I passed whatever test I was being given. The radio is just a radio now, voices from distant transmitters keeping me company in the darkness, and that's exactly how I prefer it. The woman who knocked from inside the dashboard from Redneck Rick. Truck cabs are small spaces, familiar territories where every sound has a known source, and every creak and rattle can be identified and explained. I've spent enough years behind the wheel that I know my truck better than I know my own home. Can distinguish between the normal sounds of the engine and transmission, and the warning signs that something needs attention. But there was a sound I heard one night that had no explanation, no rational source, a knocking that came from inside my dashboard, and was accompanied by a voice that pleaded for help in ways that made my blood run cold. I was driving through Northern California, hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Portland, running through the night on Interstate 5, with the road mostly to myself. It was around 2 in the morning when I first heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from somewhere in front of me, somewhere in the dashboard area. At first, I thought it was just expansion or contraction, metal parts shifting with temperature changes, but then the tapping became more insistent, more rhythmic, like someone knocking on a door. I reached out and touched the dashboard, trying to locate the source of the sound, and the moment my fingers made contact with the plastic surface, the knocking stopped. In its place came a voice, muffled and distant, but clearly audible, a woman's voice speaking in urgent tones. "Please help me. I'm trapped. I can't get out." I jerked my hand back like I'd been burned, my heart suddenly racing. I looked around the cab, checking the sleeper berth, the passenger seat, anywhere a person could possibly be hiding, but I was alone. The voice had to be coming from somewhere else. Maybe the CB radio picking up some strange signal. Maybe my phone playing audio from an app I'd forgotten was running. But when I checked the CB, it was off, and my phone was silent in its holder. The voice came again, still from inside the dashboard, still pleading, "Can you hear me? Please tell me you can hear me. I've been trapped in here for so long, and you're the first person who's touched the dashboard in weeks. Please help me get out." I pulled over onto the shoulder, my hands shaking, and sat there with the engine idling, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "Who are you?" I asked, feeling foolish for talking to my dashboard, but not knowing what else to do. "Where are you?" "I don't know," the voice answered, and I could hear desperation in it. Fear that went beyond anything I'd experienced myself. "I don't know where I am, or how I got here. All I know is that I'm trapped inside this darkness, inside this small space, and I can't move, can't see, can only hear and feel when someone touches the outside." "This doesn't make sense," I said, still looking around the cab for any rational explanation. "You can't be inside my dashboard. There's nothing in there but wiring and vents, and the instrument cluster. There's no room for a person." "I know," she said, and now she was crying, soft sobs that sounded like they were coming from miles away. "I know, it doesn't make sense, but I'm here, I'm trapped, and you're my only hope of getting out. Please, you have to believe me." Part of me wanted to dismiss this as a hallucination, stress-induced or caused by too many hours on the road without proper rest. But the voice was too clear, too specific, too real to be something my exhausted mind had manufactured. I placed my hand on the dashboard again, and I felt something, a vibration, or a pulse. Like there was something alive inside that plastic shell. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, because even though this was impossible, even though everything about it violated the laws of physics and common sense, I couldn't ignore someone asking for help, even if they were trapped in an impossible place. "Break it open," she said urgently. "Smash the dashboard, tear it apart, do whatever you have to do to make an opening. I think if there's a hole, if there's a way through, I might be able to escape." I hesitated, thinking about what I was contemplating doing to my truck, thinking about the cost of replacing a dashboard, and the questions I'd have to answer when I tried to explain why I'd destroyed it. But the woman's voice came again, more desperate now. Please, before it's too late. Before I fade away completely. I can feel myself getting weaker, feel the darkness pulling me deeper. You're my last chance. I grabbed a tire iron from my toolkit and, feeling like I was losing my mind, swung it hard into the dashboard. The plastic cracked and splintered, and I heard the woman scream, a sound of pain and fear that made me stop immediately. "Are you okay?" I called out. "Did I hurt you?" "No," she gasped. "Keep going. It hurts, but it's working. I can see light now, can see the edges of the opening. Please don't stop." I swung again and again, tearing apart the dashboard, pulling out chunks of plastic and foam and wiring, creating a hole that grew larger with each impact. And as I worked, I saw something that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. Inside the dashboard, in the space that should have contained nothing but mechanical components, I saw darkness, but not empty darkness. This was darkness with depth, darkness that seemed to go on forever, like I was looking into a void that extended far beyond the confines of my truck. And in that darkness, I saw movement, a pale shape struggling toward the light I'd created. A hand emerged from the hole in the dashboard, a woman's hand, and I grabbed it without thinking, pulling hard. The hand was cold, colder than anything I'd ever touched, but it was solid and real, and it gripped mine with desperate strength. I pulled harder, and more of her emerged, an arm, a shoulder, a head with long dark hair, matted and tangled. Her eyes were closed, her face was pale, but she was breathing, actually breathing. This impossible woman, who was somehow climbing out of my dashboard into my truck. With one final pull, she came free completely, collapsing onto the passenger seat, gasping and shaking. I sat there, stunned, looking at her, looking at the destroyed dashboard, trying to reconcile what had just happened with anything that made sense. She was real, solid, taking up space in my truck, wearing clothes that looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s. "Thank you," she whispered, opening her eyes and looking at me with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you for believing me, for helping me, for setting me free." She reached out and touched my face, and her fingers were warming up now, becoming less corpse-cold and more human-warm. "Who are you?" I asked. "How did you get trapped in my dashboard?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't remember everything. I remember being in a truck like this one, a long time ago. I remember an accident, a terrible crash. And then I remember being in the darkness, feeling the truck being torn apart around me, being salvaged and recycled and rebuilt. And I was still there, trapped in the metal and plastic, unable to get free, unable to communicate with anyone who touched the parts that contained me." "You're saying you've been trapped for decades, since the 50s, maybe longer?" "Time doesn't work the same way in that darkness. It could have been years or centuries. I have no way of knowing. All I know is that parts of me were scattered, mixed in with salvaged materials from other vehicles, and eventually those parts ended up in your truck's dashboard. And I've been there, trapped and alone, until tonight, when you finally heard me and helped me escape." We sat in silence for a while, both of us trying to process what had happened. Then she asked me to take her somewhere public, somewhere with people and lights and the normal world. Because she'd been alone in the darkness for so long that she needed to remember what it felt like to be around others. I drove her to a truck stop just outside of Reading, and we sat in the diner drinking coffee while she marveled at everything around her. The fluorescent lights and the modern clothes and the smartphones people were using. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and cried, seeing her own face for the first time in however many years she'd been trapped. When the sun started to rise, she thanked me one final time and walked out of the diner into the parking lot. I watched her go, watched as she approached a group of other drivers who were heading to their trucks, watched as she spoke to them and they welcomed her into their conversation. And then I blinked, and she was gone, vanished like she'd never been there at all. I went back to my truck and looked at the destroyed dashboard, and I found that it had repaired itself, looked brand new, like I'd never touched it with a tire iron. There was no hole, no broken plastic, no evidence that anything unusual had happened, but I knew what I'd experienced, knew what I'd seen, and heard, and done. I still have that truck, still drive it on my routes up and down the West Coast, and sometimes I touch the dashboard and wonder if there are others trapped in there, other souls caught in the recycled materials and salvaged parts. But I never hear knocking again, never hear voices asking for help. And I take that as a sign that I freed the only one who was trapped. That my dashboard is now just a normal piece of plastic and electronics with no secret passengers waiting to escape. But I'll never forget the woman who knocked from inside my dashboard. The impossible person who climbed out of a space too small to contain anything human and thanked me for believing in her existence. And I'll never stop wondering how many other vehicles on these highways contain similar trapped souls. People who died in accidents and somehow got recycled along with the metal and plastic, waiting for someone to hear them and help them find their way free. The road crew that wasn't human from Rust Belt Ron. Road construction is a fact of life for truck drivers. Those inevitable delays where you slow to a crawl and navigate through orange cones and around. Workers in reflective vests who are fixing potholes or repaving surfaces or updating infrastructure. I've driven through thousands of construction zones over my career, barely giving them a second thought beyond the annoyance of lost time and the concentration required to navigate the narrowed lanes. But there was one construction zone in rural Pennsylvania that made me question everything I thought I knew about road crews and the people who work them. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and I was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Cleveland to Philadelphia, running through Pennsylvania on a route I'd driven 100 times before. Traffic was light, weather was perfect, and I was making excellent time until I came around a curve and saw the construction signs warning of lane closures ahead. I slowed down as required, moved into the open lane, and prepared for the usual stop-and-go progress through the work zone. But as I got closer, I started to notice things that seemed off, details that didn't fit with normal construction operations. The workers were all wearing the standard reflective vests and hard hats, but they were moving in ways that seemed wrong, too synchronized, too precise, like they were all following the same choreography rather than working independently on their individual tasks. I watched as one worker bent to pick up a shovel, and at the exact same moment, 5 other workers in different parts of the construction zone bent in the exact same way, at the exact same angle, like they were all connected to the same puppet strings. They straightened up simultaneously, turned to face the same direction simultaneously, and began walking in perfect unison toward a piece of equipment. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I felt unease creeping up my spine. I told myself I was seeing patterns that weren't there, that my brain was making connections where none existed. But then I looked more carefully at the workers' faces, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. They all had the same face. Not similar faces, not related faces, but identical faces. The exact same features repeated on every single worker in the construction zone. The same nose, the same eyes, the same expression of blank focus. Duplicated over and over like someone had made copies of a single person and dressed them all in road crew uniforms. I wanted to stop, to pull over and demand an explanation, but the traffic was moving and there was nowhere to safely park my truck. So I crept forward through the construction zone, watching the workers with growing horror as they continued their perfectly synchronized movements, never speaking to each other, never varying from their coordinated actions. That's when I saw what they were actually doing, and it made no sense at all. They weren't fixing the road, or repaving, or doing any kind of normal construction work. They were removing the road, carefully lifting up sections of pavement as if it were made of sheets of paper rather than asphalt and concrete, rolling them up and carrying them to trucks that sat waiting with open beds. And underneath where the pavement had been, there wasn't dirt or gravel or any kind of foundation material. There was nothing, just emptiness, a void that seemed to extend downward forever, darkness that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The road I was driving on was floating over nothingness, supported by nothing. existing in a way that violated every law of physics and engineering I'd ever learned. The workers noticed me watching, and as one, they all turned to face my truck. Their identical faces, showing the first expression I'd seen from them. Something like curiosity mixed with warning. One of them, or maybe all of them, speaking in perfect unison, called out in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Keep moving, driver. Don't stop. Don't look too closely." Some roads aren't meant to be understood. I didn't need to be told twice. I pressed down on the accelerator, moving as fast as I dared through the construction zone. My eyes fixed on the remaining pavement ahead of me, trying not to think about the void beneath or the workers who were systematically removing reality one section at a time. Behind me, I could hear sounds of rolling and folding, the road being packed away like a temporary installation that had served its purpose and was now being dismantled. I reached the end of the construction zone and burst back into normal highway, solid pavement extending ahead as far as I could see. No workers, no equipment, no signs that anything unusual had been happening. I checked my mirrors and saw the construction zone behind me, but it was fading, becoming transparent. And within seconds it was gone completely, vanished like it had never existed. I pulled over at the next rest stop and sat there shaking, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I checked online for reports of construction on that stretch of highway, but there was nothing. No scheduled work, no notices, no acknowledgement that any road crew had been operating in that area. I called the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation and asked about it, but they had no record of any construction activity on that route. Later, I talked to other drivers who ran that same route regularly, asked if they'd ever seen road crews that seemed strange or noticed anything unusual about that particular stretch of highway. Most looked at me like I was crazy, but one older driver, a man who'd been running these roads for 40 years, gave me a look that suggested he knew exactly what I was talking about. "The maintenance crews," he said quietly, like he was sharing a secret. "Not all of them are from our world. Not all of them follow our rules. There are things that maintain the roads, keep them functional, repair them when they get damaged. And sometimes those things take forms we can recognize. We're shapes that look human enough that we don't panic when we see them. But they're not human, never were, and the work they do isn't the kind of work our engineers would understand." He told me that the roads are older than we think, that some of them existed before the first humans ever walked these lands, that they're paths laid down by forces and entities that have been traveling this world since before recorded history. And those ancient pathways need maintenance, just like modern highways do. But the maintenance isn't done by human crews with normal equipment. It's done by things that can manipulate reality, that can remove and replace sections of existence, that can work in the spaces between what is and what isn't. I don't know if I believe all of that. Don't know if I can accept that the roads I drive every day are more than just engineered surfaces connecting one place to another. But I know what I saw that afternoon in Pennsylvania, and I know that it wasn't a normal construction crew doing normal road work. I saw something that lifted away reality like it was temporary, that revealed the emptiness underneath our solid world, and that worked with a synchronization that suggested a single mind operating multiple bodies. I still drive that route sometimes, still haul loads from Cleveland to Philadelphia, but I'm always alert now for construction zones that appear without warning, for workers who move in perfect unison, for faces that repeat, like copies of copies. And when I see orange cones and reflective vests ahead, I pay close attention to what the workers are actually doing, because I've learned that not all road crews are there to repair what's broken. Some of them are there to remind us that the roads we trust, the solid ground we drive on, are more temporary and more mysterious than we ever imagined.